And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's fantastic to be with everyone here on New Year's 2019, starting off a fantastic year with everyone. Of course, as usual, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And we are rolling you into that new year. It is quite fantastic. Obviously, the incidents leading up to New Year's with the incredible Transformers blowing out and then some similar incidents across the country. We could tell we're in for a wild ride coming into this new year, and there's no question about it. And for this, now we're in the 41st episode of the X series, and this is going to be a very special one dealing with the presidents and how they deal with the group I've identified as XPROTECT. Now, XPROTECT is a group that was referred to very early on by UFO researchers like Donald Keyhoe from the Air Force in the 50s as the Silence Group. And what I've taken is basically I've extrapolated their influence politically and sort of found some very, very interesting things. As we know, there's a huge chapter missing in this period when we're starting to look at things like the UFO file. So we're going to go deep, deep into that tonight. We have a fantastic crowd already. It's very, very happy New Year. I want to say thank you to everyone for all your wishes for our happy New Year here at Dark Journalist. We've had some incredible people working with us this year, and I'm going to try to shout out through social media and everywhere else about all the great work that they've done. And we're very optimistic that there's so many important things at stake this year, and the X series, I hope, will be something that will give everyone the kind of information that they need to see what's really going on in the world and to see the real forces that are in play. Now, a little bit about the X series, of course. For those of you who know the show, it's all about X Steganography. And what we do with the X Steganography is we track it through time. Now, steganography is something that's been known since ancient times. It's referred to in medieval documents as a way to hide a text within a text. And so it makes it a little bit different from cryptography, which is more about breaking a code. With steganography, it is something that has to be out there in plain sight, and it allows the group of those initiates following that particular steganography to interpret what they're seeing without the public being any wiser that there's something going on here. Now, I originally tracked this X steganography through close to 200 programs that went black. That were involved with the U.S. government, primarily in aerospace. And these programs would resurface back up as part of these secret X planes and these other secret X projects. And they would literally bear this title over and over and over again. And I started to see the pattern so heavy duty that I started to make a list of where all of it trekked back to, and it became very obvious that there was a secret program going through these different government agencies to try to move this very, very unusual X technology, often associated with something we call the UFO file. And the UFO file open to so many different interpretations because of intel distortion and because of various marketing pushes around it that we kind of lose our way when we really think about the UFO alien part. But if we can keep it strictly in mind as something that is kept behind a wall of secrecy that is lethal, we start to get a feel and certainly an idea of what is at stake when we look at the UFO file. Largely known since the 1940s, but certainly going back before that. Now, a few things I want to hop to right away is I know that there are some very important news stories that roll right into the theme of tonight, and I've got some information on them. And Olivia, weren't you saying that it was kind of the number one question for people rolling around?
I knew it was going to come up tonight, so we might as well just launch into it.
Okay, we'll start with that right off the bat. And, it's interesting to me, too, because when looking at this information regarding the Transformers breaking, I found out that there is first of all, it's nothing like that incident. But when you go back in history, you can find something that suggests there was a very heavy-duty UFO alert in the mid-'60s right in New York, again, about this massive blackout that took place. So I want to show a few things that have really been underreported. Of course, we all know that the major Queens explosion that took place that turned the sky blue just a few nights ago. And there it is. Of course, this is somewhere around 1 o'clock in the morning, and you don't usually get that kind of nice blue sky during those hours. Now, interestingly enough, the explanations were transformer blue, but of course we've had situations like that in New York, and they haven't turned the sky blue before. So it was quite an unusual incident there that took place in Astoria. But what caught me rather, struck me very, very unusually in looking at all this was that right in that same timeline, this one on December 28th, there was a massive blowout, again, electrical explosions, this time in Louisiana. And that part, Kenner, Louisiana, it's very interesting too, because they often can attribute things to windstorms and things like that. It's not that transformers don't blow out and things don't blow up. We're quite aware of that. But I do believe that there was a massive pattern of outages and a massive pattern directly around this. It was kept under such secrecy and so compartmentalized by the media that nobody would be the wiser. My first inkling of it was on the same day that this was happening, was that the ATMs weren't working. So I experienced this up close and personal, and then I went to my favorite lunch spot here in Cambridge and asked for my normal fantastic tuna sub, and they had an incredible difficulty with that because their computers were down and their computers were locked into some of these major networks. So I started to get the handle that there was something very, very unusual going on with this. The next thing that took place was there was a massive malware attack against these news distribution, like the Los Angeles Times reported, for example. And then we had over 37 states which had no 9/11 emergency call capability. So that is a massive pattern of action, which they've tried to kind of blow over with Anderson Cooper, having a swig there on New Year's Eve. I'll have a swig myself and show how hypocritical I am. But the fascinating thing there is that they have not, in the media, put these incidents together. And it's very, very unusual to me because, of course, CenturyLink was the company controlling so much of the emergency broadcast system and how we get emergencies around, 911, fire, all the rest of it. When you start to monkey with those things, it falls into that category of massive cyber attack. And when you combine it with the explosions all around the country, as we saw from New York and Louisiana, we saw massive outages in Montana. It's a very, very unusual pattern. And for them to not play it that way is very, very strange. And of course, in a very hyper environment where we're always so on the edge about terrorism, what did the New York Times do? They started to make jokes about aliens. Ha ha ha, it's not aliens, it's just a transformer, So that's when you know things are really deep in the fire at that point, when they're not even using their ultimate false flag terrorist card. But of course, in this case, anyone, any journalist looking at that pattern would want to dig further, and unless they were instructed to. And I've observed this before in mainstream media environments where there's a kind of a choke point around news that's supposed to get out. So this is a story that we're watching very closely. Expect us to follow up on it in each of the episodes that we have coming up. But there are a few conclusions I'm coming to about it. One of them that'll dovetail nicely with the XPROTECT show is this very interesting little report from 1965 about the New York City blackout. That's Life magazine there. And this one is actually a story that's been archived on Grant Cameron's site. We know Grant is great when it comes to the UFO history aspect, and we wish him a very happy new year. And before I break into this, how are we doing out there, Olivia?
Good. Quest for Truth said all the blown transformers in New Orleans were somehow replaced within hours.
Wow.
That is impossible. Think of New Orleans also.
Yeah, right,
It's sort of like land of manana, right? It's not known for being terribly efficient. So that is kind of, they were definitely prepared for it.
Well, we love those reports on the ground. And, I've gotten all kinds of different reports from people And some of them literally have told me that they saw a craft rolling in there during this. And so I've been looking for good images and looking for good hardcore video on that. The video that I've seen is absolutely terrifying for the Louisiana explosions. And of course, I think the blue light over New York is far different than how it's being portrayed in the official story. And I want to really get down to this because this is the very heart of dark journalism, the way that I've laid it out here, that there's three fundamental rules to dark journalism. It's very simple. The official story is on top. The counter story, which is often called the conspiracy theory, is brought up in the middle, usually by independent researchers, professors, authors, and all the rest of it. And then on the bottom is junk conspiracy, I call it third force. That comes in, it's usually rolled out in order to get and discourage people who are looking into the second level counter story, so that they say, oh, it's too crazy, I'll go back to the official story. We see this pattern roll out over and over again. And in this case, it's either, we've got this official story that we had some transformer that blew out, oddly enough, all over the country, along with the 911 system and the news distribution network. That just sort of happened all at the same time. Isn't that interesting? Santa Claus must have crashed into the tower. Ha ha. Then we've had some really wild, conspiracy, junk conspiracy stuff, just saying like, it's the ET is giving us a sign. And right in the middle, we've had people just tearing into this. And I've picked up on some of that. And I'm presenting it to you here because I think it's important. Of course, with me in this show, the last thing in the world that we do is any kind of fanning of the flames or any kind of fear porn reporting. But that incident, those incidents, I think, need to be tracked very closely, and we'll do it much better as a group.
Footloose wanted to know, could it be manufactured in order to replace the current infrastructure ready for 5G? It's kind of a good theory.
Yeah. Well, these are the types of questions I think we need to look at. When you just blow that stuff away, I suppose that's more of an insurance question. Certainly someone in the insurance field.
I'm much more of a conspiracy theorist than you are on this whole thing.
I wouldn't deny
that. Spidey senses were going crazy around this, yes. And I thought, this does not look good to me.
No, I absolutely agree.
I thought it was directly related to the yellow vests in Paris and what's going on there.
Isn't that interesting?
They need to be prepared for protests like that coming here.
Well, I can tell you this much, which is, we talk to the very best experts on this show and have really the very best network of independent reporters to lock in with and compare notes. And let me tell you, nobody on this end of the spectrum is taking this lightly. It was very, very unusual. And the instant playing it down afterwards is even more bizarre. So we're keeping our eyes on that. But let's roll the clock back a little bit from 2019 all the way back to 1965 and take a look at this Northeast blackout. So this is a period of time right after the Kennedy assassination. It's 1965 now. Johnson is president. And there's a number of very unusual things that are taking place with this blackout. Of course, what they're really worried about is the massive looting and the chaos that can take place in a major city like New York. So I'm going to just read a couple of major things about this and how James Mcdonald, who was a really hardcore UFO researcher who really got the stuff to Congress and then was silenced by XPROTECT, is going to be kind of our way into the topic for this tonight. I want to remind everyone you're watching Dark Journalist. It's great to have everyone here. Of course, this is our first show for the new year. Welcoming everyone. We'll be back in our regular time slot of 7 o'clock on Friday. Also, yes.
Esoteric 369 Wall wanted to know, Daniel,
yes.
Did you miss us like we missed you?
Absolutely. Listen, I can't function without all the stimulation of the questions and the back and forth that we have on this show. The very best audience out there. And I think Olivia can attest to the fact that I've not been taking it too easy. I've been really pretty hardcore.
No, there's tons of exciting things coming this year
that
we will not reveal yet.
Just you wait. You're in for an incredible treat with the X series and some of the things that are going to be coming forward. And it's good, too, because I think we've laid the real platform there with the first 40 episodes. They're there. We've made them available to the public. But I think what's going to happen here is they're going to form a kind of foundation for the things that we're going to roll out here in the new year. And it's very exciting, and we never take for granted that we're on this mission with all of you. So it's fantastic to have everyone here. And XPROTECT is interesting. I do get into Men in Black aspects with it because the Men in Black are at the very heart of the early reporting around XPROTECT. And XPROTECT, to sum up, is basically a group that is committed because the UFO file is at a level that's higher, a bigger secret than the atomic bomb. They're committed to keeping the silence around it at any cost. And so they'll protect it, and they usually protect it and have such a grip on the media that it's pretty easy to kind of spin the stories that they want to spin, or roll out the loons that they want to roll out, so that they become easily discredited, versus, the media really portraying the real story and looking at the real experts and the great research and the document trail that exists around the UFO file. Now, what we do have is a split situation there, because there are aspects of XPROTECT that seem to be outside of any group's capability. That is, even forces inside of intelligence and the FBI are looking at this XPROTECT group and trying to figure out exactly how it forms. Very much like Professor Scott's notion of the deep state, it's not something that is there as a structure. It is more like a system. It's something that moves together when it needs to in order to block certain types of things from coming out. Now, I think part of the XPROTECT group has deduced that there are going to be certain things around the UFO file that they can use here over the next decade to really shore up their position. And we saw a great clash in the 2016 election over those two forces fighting it out. And as we still see that rolling out with the TTSA side, the CIA corporate marketing wing of the UFO thing, and then Trump with the Space Force trying to get that power back from these aerospace companies using executive power. These are two major clashes that we're right in the middle of, and they're going to dominate 2019 way more than the Democrat-Republican split in Congress. So this is really where the action is going to be at. XPROTECT is important in this sense, which is that when you see these UFO researchers over time, some people have compiled these lists of these UFO researchers, like Mactoney's and James Mcdonald, and all the way back to Morris Jessup, and all the very unusual, just suicided over and over again. And that goes with a lot of people working on breakthrough energy methods and breakthrough motors and things like that. We've seen so many of them rubbed out. XPROTECT really works specifically around the ramifications of letting the UFO file out ahead of them. Now, there are a couple of terms that we use in this program that I want to get everybody on board with. And if you've watched the show, you're familiar with them, but I'm going to pretend that this is your first show. And so that main phrase is Apotheum. And I'm going to spell it out here. It's Apotheum, Apotheum. And this is a word that I have come across. It's a root. The roots of it are in Greek, and I've run across it in medieval documents dealing with Hermeticism. And I've decided that this is a factor of a kind of a runaway physics that over time these mystery schools were passing on this knowledge of. That's where the early X Steganography comes from, because it goes all the way back. You can find it in the Book of the Dead with the Egyptians, on the Egyptian mystery schools, moving on to the Chaldean mystery schools and the Babylonians. And they're hearkening back to this older catastrophe of this high technology civilization. We call it Atlantis because Plato called it Atlantis, and he said it was a true story, that they were a very advanced culture and that they, in essence, destroyed themselves. So that's where we get so much of this. Now, we've done some very powerful shows in November and December with Chi-Chi Young, and they were dealing with the Ernest Hemingway tie to Cuba, and how Ernest Hemingway, being there in Bimini with his brother and founding New Atlantis, were actually part of a group that was searching for Atlantis because it had been predicted to rise there through Edgar Cayce, who was the sleeping prophet of the 20th century. Now, when we look at those factors from the standpoint of land rising, it causes all of these different bells to go off. And so there's a high tension area there right in the Bahamas, and the Hemingways were wrapped up in it, and we saw all sorts of unusual things around the Hemingways as a result of this. We've also seen that the Hemingways, through Hillary Hemingway, who was Ernest's niece, getting into, she wrote this series of UFO books. So really, really strong connections there. And we also saw through Margot Hemingway that pressure that gets put on that family because of this legacy of the things that Ernest was involved in dealing with this. So that end of the spectrum is so important. And we are going to continually roll that out as we do these shows. But I think it's kind of good for us to get the setup for this by understanding that there's an Atlantis rising component when we're talking about things that need to be disclosed. And the Atlantis rising component is crucial because it not only involves physical changes, it involves the actual past, our grand past and its high technology. And so the word that has been passed down from all this, the effect that they've been taking care to keep secret in the mystery schools that then converted probably through Masonic channels into the UFO file secrecy, is Apotheum. And what it is, it represents something more than just hiding alien craft or something like that. It's much more about a type of physics that comes in and creates a reality distortion field. That is, whenever we get around this UFO story, people are always saying, oh, I missed all this time. My clock was running backwards. And it causes blackouts, and we get all these unusual effects when UFOs are around. Plants won't grow, and all the rest of it. That kind of runaway physics creates this Apotheum effect, and so that's something about their physics coming in here, and whatever you want to say that those craft are. When they come here, they create this Apotheum effect. Apotheum is something I think we're going to understand more and more. But every time we get into, when they go into high strangeness around the UFO aspect, you're getting really close to the Apotheum part. That's the part that XPROTECT is sworn to guard and to eliminate any possible kind of threats to that coming out public. This is one of the main problems. So I think more than just saying, well, they're afraid if they announce that there are off-world civilizations, that the Pope will be out of a job, in essence. But I don't see it that way. I see that there's an effect that was been created when we interface with this type of breakaway physics. This is the nature of their problem, keeping that secret. And the reason is because they don't have perfect mastery of it as of yet. And the idea of that kind of uncontrollable physics situation getting in the hands of someone else completely destroys their power base. So there is a small group that is dedicated at all costs to keep that in their hands. And what we see are these unusual attempts to bring out any kind of public disclosure around these things are either watered down or thwarted or ridiculed or commercialized so that they're not recognizable as anything that can actually do anything for an actual political process in the world. So as far as a geopolitical consideration, movements for disclosure are basically nothing. They amount to nothing. But actual understanding of what's being guarded inside of the UFO file, this Apotheum effect, that can help us all to understand the situation and to get at it without any kind of official disclosure. That's important. Now, a few things I think that we can put into this, since we're on the subject, is the secret space program. Now, the secret space program is another one of these areas where when you get disclosure about it, what are you actually talking about? What kind of disclosure do you want? Now, I have some quotes that are go all the way back to President Reagan and his diary. They put out a number of his diary excerpts. And I plan to read that later. But one of the things that's in those excerpts, he's talking about how we're going to be able to have a shuttle that'll take 300 astronauts into space, and how they're so ready to do that in 1986. So, it is true that when we look out some 32 years later and it's not here, it's quite unusual. So what happened to all that technology they were building up to? Well, let's take a look at a chart that's going to help us out. And before I jump into this chart, Miss Olivia, how are we doing out there?
I'm laughing because Living Soul, Quickening Spirit is quoting Excalibur, which of course I quoted from in a very great episode that people loved.
Oh, that's the Tua Dedanan.
Yes, which seems to be everybody's favorite episode.
Isn't that interesting? Well, I get that, or the Alice in CERN Wonderland. Those two episodes seem to be everyone's favorite. But of course, I should say the biggest X episode that we did last year was Tesla, Trump, and the Time Capsule.
Huge!
350,000 views on that. And I get, I'm still getting questions from people who are just discovering that episode, but that one seems to have really stood out.
We should have monetized that.
Well, this is a good point. Like, I'll tell you, it's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up. I really am against monetization. That is, I don't want to run commercials on my videos, because just as I'm getting to something important, it's going to come in with a commercial.
It's not just that. You have no control over what the commercial is, and would you even support the product or the service?
Yeah, it might be one of those horrible Ford car commercials or something. So, or worse, like a YouTube music commercial. That's really bad. But the truth is that I'm sort of dedicated to keeping the channel commercial free, and that's because I want to be 100% supported by viewers like you. And I want that to be kind of the covenant that we have going back and forth. So it's very easy when you guys subscribe. Right now, we're going to keep the discount in place for the next couple of weeks to get everyone on board, and then we'll go back to a normal price. But basically, that's a way to support us, and you get, you're going to get some very important X dialogues. You're going to get bonus content. It's going to be a great way to do it. What you should do is go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the free newsletter. That's step one, because we know how iffy the social media networks are. And step two is when you sign up to support the show, that gives us the ability to stay commercial free. And there's no sponsorships. I've never had a sponsor of any kind on the show. I'd like to keep it that way, because I think with the nature of the type of work that we're doing, that it's great too, because I see a lot of support out there. What I'm really thinking about is that we can really bring this to you in the best possible way if we have that back and forth. So don't be shy. Go ahead and subscribe for the new year. It's gonna, this is what we've been doing in a number of ways. Of course, we support groups like WikiLeaks, and we're tied in.
Cat shelters.
Cat shelters, right? We're behind 100% the efforts of like Solari.com or GizaDeathStar.com, Joseph Farrell's site. These are the things that we're invested in driving people to make sure they get to see that good quality material. ForbiddenKnowledgeTV.net, Alexandra Bruce's website. Happy New Year, Alexandra. Of course, we're going to have her back on the show soon. Right now is a great time because we have the best people and the best material. Gigi Young, who's a regular on the program, just amazing work that's available. So this is really the perfect time to find the good stuff and sort of eschew and push back on the junk conspiracy stuff, which, one of the latest big junk conspiracies is there's this barge with all the criminals, and Soros and Clinton are on it. It's headed for Gitmo, everyone. There's no barge headed for Gitmo. We have to deal with what's going on here. I want to say on planet Earth, and we're talking about aliens. Isn't that good? But it is, the subjects are grounded, and the information we're going to give you is based on evidence. We're not going to lead you down a wild road of cabal arrests and this kind of thing. Even though we might share the sentiments of people who want to clean up the swamp and clean up the system, I'd like to stick to what is actually happening and what we can actually get accomplished, because the fantasy stuff, the kind of adult fairy tale thing about this barge going to Gitmo, these are the types of things that become the hope porn, which is the opposite of the fear porn. And it's something that Catherine Austin Fitts identifies as hope porn, and she thinks of it as very counterproductive, and we've learned that really quite well from her. So it's very important to keep our really hardcore vigilance up when we look at these things, and to take things like that with a grain of salt, shall we say.
Right. So they are asking about Super Chat, which we have addressed before.
Yeah, Super Chat would be another way to support the show. And that also has an aspect of monetization. So I have to consider it and look at it. And I will look at it over the course.
But like, why do we want Google to get more of our money?
That's a really good point. Unbelievable. It is. It's like a 70-30 split or something like that. But
why should they get anything?
I know. Well, this is the nature of the thing. The best way to support the show is just go to the site and sign up for the subscription. It's, what is it, $4 a month? Something incredible like that.
Ridiculous.
But do it by January 15th, because that way you're going to get in there.
Yeah, the other thing is, and everybody wants gear now. They want swag.
This is because
don't you have enough swag?
It's because they're looking at the Starsky and Hutch present. I'm going to show that at the end of the show. It's very funny Christmas present. Of course, Starsky and Hutch was a great show. But yeah, it is quite fascinating. Look, my thing is I'm very dedicated to keeping the show commercial free, and that's really, I think, an important type of commitment that we can make. And so hopefully in this environment, we can stick to that. Now,
I'm going to say one more thing. Dinobot XIV says, I want a bumper sticker. If you guys have, if there's anything that you want, we've been talking about different ideas, and even throwing it out to the audience about designing the gear they want. Why not throw it out to the audience? So,
I mean, I definitely think it's all in a good way to support the show. I'm always up for anything that makes it easier for us to get where we're going with it. So we're definitely looking into it. I'll put it to you that way. Okay, so wow, 2019 with a bang, and here we are. Now, this is very important. When we talk about the Space Force, and everyone's like, oh, they're talking about the Space Force. Isn't that interesting? And Catherine Austin Fitts did a report on the space economy, things like space tourism and asteroid mining and things like that. And she's got into this kind of helping us to understand the money side of space. Very important, because that's all kept under the continuity of government rules, which means it's secret, even to Congress. So we have to think about space in terms of money, and we have to also think about space in terms of its influence and what we're doing up there. For example, one of the things that Trump laid out is that we have to make it so that space is a war-fighting domain. In fact, there are hardcore, and I mean hardcore, treaties that we have with other countries that prevent that from happening. So that is the kind of bluster I don't think that's very helpful. However, Trump's move to apprehend the Space Force and to grab that Space Council and to be part of that discussion is reactionary against this other move which was coming from the Clinton forces. They were going to come in and grab this whole issue with this phony alien threat thing, get money going through Congress and through Elizondo, who was the basically, the man he reported to was the drone king, John Brennan. Elizondo with the TTSA, who they put out there as their front man, he was the person who was just coming forward and saying, well, there's a threat. We don't know what it is, but hey, let's get this going. And by the way, we're not going to deal with normal channels. We're going to go directly to the media about this. Forget about the whole UFO community or that whole thing. And they're going to pretend that, 70 some odd years of UFO research never took place, and just say, there might be something going on and the CIA should be in charge of it. No, that's a big no. The CIA, if anything, is an extra constitutional force. And the person who set up the CIA, Harry Truman, definitely after the Kennedy assassination put out a major rebuttal to the CIA and basically said, reform it or scrap it. And I'm pretty sure that's what Kennedy was trying to do also. The last thing in the world we need is counterintelligence forces inside the UFO file. That's the worst possible scenario. Okay, reaching for the moon. Let's take a look at this. This is a list of our various shots into space and the moon. And you'll notice something quite interesting. It's very active, very, very, very active back here. This is the 1960s, and this is the big push after Sputnik, and NASA gets in there, and we finally get to the moon about in here after all these different activities, and something very strange happens after a few visits to the moon. You'll notice everything drops off dramatically. And this drop goes on, as you can see on the bottom here, through decades and decades and decades and decades. And we get a little activity here with what they were talking about doing with Star Wars, but never actually did. 1990s, the 2000s, there's a little bit of effort, and then suddenly, boom, the United States, something brewing over here with the Space Force. Now, when we look at this, it's quite interesting. How do you go from spending all of this money, pouring all of this money into a public program called NASA, which is to get us to the moon, to get us into space, orbiting, and all the rest of it, and then literally drop off and go black for 50 some odd years and then come back with just one little interim, which was saying we were going to do Star Wars SDI, which supposedly was something that allowed us to develop the type of technology. And there's a whole story to that because, of course, it brings in the whole Norm Berggren thing about what he was observing operating inside the rings of Saturn, which he saw were large-scale craft, and how this type of information was being telegraphed back to Reagan, who was freaking out and saying, we need to find a lot of money in order to create this Star Wars thing, and it's going to be black money. And we get a massive Iran-Contra drug ring that almost takes the entire administration down. What was that all about? So this is the type of thing, the type of situation we get into politically when we look at it. But we have to look at individuals who fought the battle, won it or lost it, and then we'll understand where the battle is at, which is why we need to go back in history a little bit. So let's start off with this, since we're talking about the TTSA. Yes, Miss Olivia?
Now I lost what I was
that's okay.
Say.
That's all right. We'll get back to it. I'm rolling anyway.
Oh, I was going to say, didn't Norm Berggren say that the rings of Saturn were actually created by those craft?
Yeah, he was saying actually that they were fueled by it, but that they were ring makers, and that's why Jupiter was starting to have rings and Uranus was starting to have rings. Berggren put out the book Ring Makers of Saturn in 1985. He'd had an earlier book in 71, and there were the foundation of what he put out there. Now, he did have an interview later on with Carrie Cassidy, and she caught him at that point there before he died. But I actually think that he probably let more out in the book because he was very cagey in the interview. But obviously, he was dedicated to it until the time he died, that this is the type of imagery he was looking at. And he told some very interesting stories also in there about how he was showing, he was talking with various NASA people, and they were looking at some of the pictures that he had, and that he had identified kind of ruins on the moon, and that they had basically said, hey, how did you get that? We shaded that out. How did you bring that back up? So he understood pretty quickly that they were blacking these types of things out, as we've heard over and over again. So what's the big secret? That there were ruins on the moon, or that there's some kind of structure there that reflects an off-world culture, and we have to keep that a secret? There's a lot going on in there. So let's look at some of the efforts that have taken place to try and bring this out in a responsible way, and the efforts that have taken on a very pernicious, sinister character to do the same thing, but under this, we're under attack thing, and the CIA push around the alien front. Let's start with Harry Reid. Of course, Harry Reid, the senator from Nevada, he certainly played a big role in the New York Times TTSA story about the Pentagon program AATIP. Now, all through last year, we went through a number of different scenarios about AATIP and how it was largely set up as a corporate front for CIA management of a UFO narrative. And we saw over and over again the things that they were promising, and the things that they were doing publicly just didn't add up. And it was, every time we turned around, there were more CIA people popping out of the blue. And it's not the kind of thing where you literally say, oh, I think that guy's a CIA agent. These are actual CIA people. I mean, Elizondo's CIA. It's on the record. All of those people predominantly are either Lockheed Martin or CIA, and except for the one guy that they had in the middle as the patsy, which is Tom DeLonge. So I think that we did a good job of pointing that out. And I will say this, much to my disappointment, some of my UFO heroes from back in the day chummed up to Elizondo and the phony CIA TTSA story and the New York Times push and all that. And I was not very happy about that. And I think that they after a year or two of that, they certainly, looking back on it, it's not very pretty. So, but it is important that groups like MUFON and all the rest of it don't try to get us into promoting the CIA's version of UFO disclosure. That would be a disaster, in my opinion. But Reed did take a pretty big role in this. And he, along with Bob Bigelow from Bigelow Aerospace, pumped up this whole story around this AA tip program, which, by the way, was only a $22 million program. And there's no way in hell that Elizondo was even a part of that program in the time frame that he said he was, because we presented images of him working for a shipping company during that time and doing kind of other CIA work, fighting FARC rebels in South America and terrorists in Afghanistan. How this guy, rolled into the lowly UFO desk at the Pentagon with CIA support, something very, very strange about that story. But I am going to go into Harry Reid's quote in that New York Times article, because it brings up something very crucial and important about the XPROTECT group and this kind of UFO battle that's been going on. From the New York Times, that special edition that came out December 17th, 2017. 2017, yes. Quote, Mr. Reid said he met with agency officials shortly after his meeting with Mr. Bigelow, Bob Bigelow, and learned that they wanted to start a research program on UFOs. Mr. Reid then summoned Mr. Stevens and Mr. Inouye. Okay, so that's Senator Ted Stevens from Alaska, who died in a plane crash in 2010, and Daniel Inouye, who was the person who was a very interesting thing where he hushed up Oliver North during the Iran-Contra thing, when Oliver North brought up the continuity of government program. Very, very important moment in history. But Inouye also died. So the only one left who was directing this, supposedly, is Reid. Quote, Harry Reid, I had talked to John Glenn a number of years before, Mr. Reid said, referring to the astronaut and former senator from Ohio, who died in 2016. Mr. Glenn, Mr. Reid said, had told him he thought that the federal government, should be looking seriously into UFOs and should be talking to military service members, particularly pilots who had reported seeing aircraft they could not identify or explain. Okay, this is very interesting, because Harry Reid is putting it off on astronaut John Glenn that this program got started about looking into it, because they somehow wanted the umbrella of this noble figure. Very interestingly, this end of the whole UFO disclosure operation that's going on through the CIA, Harry Reid and TTSA, they were coming in on this one side, and people like Glenn, as I'm going to show right now, were coming in from this other side. And that was the original JFK side, which was bring this out to the public and share it with other nations. And Glenn was very, very close, of course, being one of the first men in space, period. But he was also very, very close to the Kennedys. And again, over and over again, when you go to find out where the main problem, main shutdown happened, where things went black, you always find yourself right in the heart of the JFK assassination and all the ramifications that took place there. That's when the overt government got taken over by the covert side, and we've been dealing with that mess and unraveling it ever since. Many, many years before some of us were born. Now, let's take a look at the situation. And let's take a look at it through the figure of John Glenn. Now, of course, we know that Neil Armstrong, of course, made it there, and that the trail that was blazed by Gordon Cooper and John Glenn is how Neil Armstrong became that man on the moon. Now, we also should keep in mind the things that we were getting from Norm Berggren relating to the moon, and how he had seen some things in these photos, and the NASA scientists came over and said, hey, how did you get that? We thought we had obscured those. So they know, they're in the know about ruins being on the moon, whatever those ruins might represent. Glenn is a very, very important character. That's good. Everywhere I grab, there's like a new UFO photo. That's nice. This is a picture of Glenn in one of those early programs when they were developing the Mercury space program in relation to Blue Gemini, which I have a couple of XPROTECT X series episodes on, and I highly recommend those. because that's where the real secret space program started. And Glenn is a very important figure. A couple of things from his bio. This is a nice picture of him with President Kennedy, who was largely a mentor to him and a number one supporter. Got him into politics, where he served as the senator from Ohio, ran for president in 1984, and was rumored to become Jimmy Carter's president when they were really considering this push around the UFO disclosure aspect. Very, very important period of time. A little bit about Glenn. So before joining NASA, Glenn was a distinguished fighter pilot in World War II, China, and Korea. He was awarded 6 Distinguished Flying Crosses and 18 Air Medals. I mean, the guy was a true American hero. He made the first supersonic continental flight across the United States. His onboard camera took the first continuous panoramic photograph of the United States. It's quite significant. He was one of the Mercury 7 military test pilots selected in 1959 by NASA as the nation's first astronauts. On February 20th, 1962, Glenn flew the Friendship 7 mission, becoming the first American to orbit the Earth and the 5th person and 3rd American in space. He received the NASA Distinguished Service Medal in 1962 and Congressional Space Medal of Honor in 1978. He was inducted into the U.S. Astronaut Hall of Fame in 1990 and was the last surviving member of the Mercury 7. A lot of interesting 7s around him. When he was 77, he went back into space, so he became the oldest man to ever be in space. Glenn resigned from NASA in January of 64, which is very unusual, by the way, since he was such a prominent astronaut. He planned to run for U.S. Senate seat from Ohio, so on and so forth. Eventually, he got in. In 1998, while still a sitting senator, Glenn flew on the Discovery Space Shuttle STS-95 mission and became the oldest person to fly in space and the only person to fly in both Mercury and Space Shuttle programs. Received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2012. There's also a very interesting Trump connection to Glenn, and of course, Trump also makes a presidential proclamation declaring Glenn a hero. So we've got kind of an idea of this very incredibly solid individual who was part of that early space program that was still under the heading of JFK. Now, JFK had a number of problems managing this because there were 2 programs. One was called Blue Gemini and the other Dinosaur. And the way that we've got some whistleblowers from the past, like Philip Corso, who had worked in the Eisenhower and JFK and Johnson administrations in pretty high positions from the Foreign Technology Office, he said that a lot of the X program, that is the secret planes that were developed by Walter Dornberger, who we had brought over in Project Paperclip, was a major Nazi scientist and who was von Braun's boss and had access to incredibly high technology that the Nazis were in final stages of developing. So when we got him, we got Dornberger on board. He was developing these X planes for us that still hold the speed records, even though they were flying in the 60s. But one of the things that Corso said, without a doubt, and that you could take to the bank, was that the X-15 program and the secret plane programs were about one thing, which was UFO recon. Now, that's very significant because they're portrayed in history as just going for it, going for the gusto. And there's so much information about the X series that was kept secret, most of it until 2010, actually. And we've only really been getting all the details about it recently, which is why the X series, in a way, becomes almost like a Rosetta Stone for reading how these programs developed and went black. Like when we saw the chart, those periods of non-activity, I'm going to go back to it for a second, represent very significant periods where they're still working on it. It's just nothing happens publicly. That's a gigantic gap. I mean, it's ludicrous if you really consider it. But now they're ready with the privatization, with the space tourism, with the networking from space to really bring all this stuff online. And by the way, it creates a massive global control grid here on the surface. And we have people coming up in January like Elena Freeland, who can tell us so much about how the space fence works in relation to this. But going back to this, we're going to learn through figures how this whole sort of fight plays out. So again, Glenn, a major protege of Kennedy's. Kennedy wanting the open space program. Kennedy, who had brought forward, as I've discussed on this program with Douglas Caddy, the former Watergate lawyer, the revelations that he came forward with, that Kennedy was in large measure eliminated over the UFO file because he wanted to share that information. He's also much more open about it. He expected NASA to be, he's very concerned about NASA, and we can see this in him sending his defense secretary over there to basically say in records that are declassified now in 2014 that, what's going on? Why do we have two space programs? And it is literally this group that has coalesced, part of them out of NACA, which was the original NASA, like von Braun and other figures like that, who brought their command structure over from Nazi Germany. And they're in there working in NASA independently. And he basically wanted NASA to be a non-military environment. But he does something quite extraordinary, that is President Kennedy. He sends his defense secretary over to NASA, and he says, you're going to turn Blue Gemini back over to the military. They're going to have it. Because at least he must have been figuring, I know what's going on there. I don't know what's happening with this other thing. And he couldn't seem to get his hands on it. So later, something quite remarkable comes out, which is that one of the main figures in the X story is this guy Bannister character. And I go back to him over and over again because he was an FBI agent who was assigned to look into all of those X files. That is, he was the man who went out and checked out all of the UFO sightings. And there are newspaper clippings of him, etc. Now, we've featured him in a few episodes, quite a few in this series, so you're probably familiar with him. But if you're not, he was an FBI chief in Chicago, but he was working there in the Pacific Northwest, investigating UFO cases in the late 40s, very early on. And what's interesting is that Jim Garrison, who investigated the Kennedy assassination, had interesting things to say about him, that it was very unusual that he had shown up there acting as a private eye in New Orleans, and that Lee Harvey Oswald was working for him, which is strange because Guy Bannister is this character who was an anti-communist, fighting communism, fighting Castro and all the rest of it in that period. And Oswald is supposed to be this incredible communist who, rather be red than anything else. So that whole strange association of Bannister with Oswald and then Bannister's association with the UFO file is quite interesting because there's a lot of XPROTECT activity around Oswald when we go into it. One of the most interesting things that was reported shortly after the Kennedy assassination is that all of these men in black showed up at the Atsugi base in Japan looking for information on Oswald, who had been there in 1959. So it was 4 years earlier, and there's just a number of unusual interlocking pieces with that. Like when Oswald was working in New Orleans at the Riley Coffee Company, he was saying to people when he was leaving that he was going to join NASA. So whenever you get around Oswald, there's all kinds of unusual X factors going on in relation to the UFO file around him. And it's never quite clear exactly what it is that's happening there. So let's keep going with John Glenn. The Kennedys decided to really put a lot into Glenn helping them develop the space program that they wanted to develop. And they wanted him to be the public face of it. They didn't even want him going up into space anymore because they were worried about how safe that could be in the long run. And if they lost him, what a disaster it would be. And it turned out that they wanted him as the real political frontman for the space program that they wanted to do. This open version, which was when I go to the moon with the Russians, and it was going to be cooperation in space versus a space race. That's a very different kind of environment. It's a very different type of situation. So what winds up happening is that when Kennedy's assassinated, Glenn is still close, actually, to the Kennedy family. And what he does is he comes out in support of Robert Kennedy, trying to get him into the White House. And again, the Kennedys are trying to get Glenn into position politically where they can use him to help build up the space infrastructure and create this new space dynamic. The New Frontier. Now, a couple of interesting things about Glenn that are not widely known is that he encountered UFOs when he was in space. This is one of his photographs of what they call these fireflies that he saw. So you can get much from that. I'm fascinated by Glenn because there have always been rumors about him in relation to the UFO aspect, and we see some direct things. I found some audio here, which I'm going to play. Let's see if this is going to happen. Olivia, while I'm getting this, you want to tell me how we're doing out there?
We're doing great. I've got so many questions. Whenever you're ready.
We will. We're going to jump into questions in a little bit. I'm going to remind everyone you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's great to have everyone here. What a huge crowd for New Year's. And we are on XPROTECT Overdrive here in X episode 41, XPROTECT and the Presidents. And we're going to just keep diving into the information here. This is John Glenn's account of seeing these UFOs, the fireflies. Here we go. Yeah.
They lit up like they're luminescent. I never saw anything like it. They're around the little, they're going by the capsule, and they look like little stars, a whole shower of them going by. They swirl around the capsule and go in front of the window, and they're all brilliantly lighted. They probably average maybe 7 or 8 feet apart, but I can see them all down below me also.
Yeah. What he's saying there is that he's out there and they're all over him. Everywhere he turns, there are these basically like Foo Fighters everywhere he turns, and they're fireflies all over him. So it's a very unique UFO sighting, and he's one of the first astronauts who's blurting this out as it's happening. So they learn shortly after that to really monitor those communications, because we know later that astronauts will say things and that they will get scrubbed from the record. So now this starts to make a little more sense when we take into account what Corso was saying about how the really fast space planes that we were developing were for UFO recon, and how we have Glenn in the middle of the Kennedy push for what we'll basically call a moral space program, the high ideal space program, as opposed to the space warfighting domain program, controlling things from space. So when the torch is passed to Robert Kennedy, he goes to run. And again, Glenn is by his side and doing all of this. And in fact, Glenn will take his children, Kennedy's children, back after Kennedy is assassinated in California. That's how close Glenn was to the Kennedys. And it was Kennedy, Ted Kennedy, who urged him to run in 1984 when Reagan was developing the Star Wars SDI program, which was set up ostensibly as the Strategic Defense Initiative to shoot down missiles from outer space. But they knew something else was going on there, and a number of people were convinced that Reagan had been misled by the CIA to develop this robust program in space. And of course, I've brought forward on this program for a fact, and I mean, it cannot be denied, it's on video, that Gorbachev was in the press club with Charlie Rose before the scandal, and that he was talking with him, and Kissinger's in the audience, and they're there with George Shultz reminiscing about the old days. And out of the blue, Gorbachev says, you know, Reagan took me aside at Reykjavik and said very intensely, if aliens invade, will you help us? And he was dead serious. And that Gorbachev said, of course we will. And Reagan said, good, because we're going to help you too. So, I mean, that whole room, the press club, you know, Henry Kissinger looks like he's going to die on the spot. And Charlie Rose starts to laugh and be like, you know, oh, what a good joke. Ha ha, you know. But I think something really major happened in that. You can't take it back. It's sort of the Pandora's box out of it. We know that Reagan was really thinking at that point, probably based on the information that Bergeron was speaking about these ringmakers, these large-scale craft that were out there, that we needed a major defense against whatever it was that was flying around out there. So, and that's where some of these unusual continuity of government program players come in and create things like Iran-Contra, funneling money through drug sales to these groups. So it's a very unusual setup. And I talk about continuity of government in a few programs. So if you're looking at the X series, you're going to find that information. I won't go so deep on that here, but I will say this, that the same forces that are trying to get Glenn into office, that Kennedy wing, that represents the kind of moral, idealistic space thing versus the space fighting domain people. We have to keep that mix going in our minds because Glenn is a central figure in this. Now, 1, he's seen UFOs. That's important. He's aware. 2, he's a political figure. 3, he has the Kennedy backing. 4, he becomes someone who later is cited by who? Harry Reid. Supposedly, Harry Reid is taking the mantle of John Glenn's idealistic space approach and saying, John Glenn is the one who told us to start ATIP. Okay, well, let's just take him at his word for now. But you can see, in any case, that Glenn is right at the very heart of this battle between these two forces about what is going to happen in space. That's important. On the Kennedy side, of course, once they assassinate Robert Kennedy, he's again kind of robbed of this position of the leadership of this idealistic space service. Okay, yes.
Now, John has a good question. How much does DJ think Reagan was able to operate separately from H.W. Bush? How much does H.W. how much was he working against him?
Oh, well, he was working against him from day one.
Mm-hmm. Well, including the assassination attempt.
Yeah, right.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. It's still not explained how John Hinckley, who was a friend of the Bushes, is never investigated for those links. He's actually out now. This is amazing that John Hinckley is actually walking the streets after this attempt on President Reagan in 1981. And they had another phony setup, just like with Mark David Chapman, Catcher in the Rye, but his was Jodie Foster. And I'm obsessed with Jodie Foster, so I have to kill the president. Okay, that makes good copy, but it leaves a lot of questions. Let's go back to Kennedy and Glenn for a minute and get some real... Remember Kennedy's version of the space program. It's very, very different. He wants cooperation with the Russians. He wants to open this up. But he's dealing at NASA now with an infrastructure that was created under Eisenhower, where we brought over the space scientists from Germany. And they want their kind of dominance in space. And somewhere in that American deep state working in collusion with this, we're getting a very aggressive version of it. Now, I don't think the Russians in that period were saints by a long shot. I'm sure they would have been happy to have been aggressive also. But I'm saying fundamentally, it appears that there were hawks and doves on both sides. And it's when the doves get together on either side of the spectrum that the hawks move in and blow them away. So I find that quite interesting because we've brought this in a few different ways. Let's take a look here, considering that idealistic space program. I want to find something very unusual, of course, happened at the end that's related to UFOs. Again, during the 1990s in the situation comedy Frasier. They had John Glenn on in there, and I am going to read his copy later, but I didn't record this, but that's a snapshot of him in the series. And basically what happens is while they're fighting over some matter in the background, he sits there on radio and dishes out how they saw UFOs when they were out there, but that they weren't allowed to talk about it. But I thought it was very telling and kind of possibly even a shot across the bow against XPROTECT and the aggressive version that the truth could come out through individuals as distinguished as John Glenn. And other people could just say, well, it was comedy or whatever. But, this is the way that these things often play out. I want to remind everyone that you're watching The Dark Journalist Show and to take a moment to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter. Now is kind of the perfect time to do this because with social media the way it is at the beginning of 2019 and the incredible crackdowns that we've seen, make sure that you and I have that communication going on. And it's a direct pipeline. What you'll do basically is you'll get about once a week in your inbox fascinating newsletter, just letting you know what shows are coming up, what guests we have lined up, and what important events are breaking. I do want to announce here, without saying what events they are going to be, that I can now put my hands on about 5 different events that we are going to be a part of this year. So this is going to be a very active, a very public year in terms of bringing the show to you, and we're going to be giving you that information as it comes in. So that's another good reason to join and to be a part of the newsletter. Now, it just takes a couple minutes to sign up, and we'll send you that those updates about once a week. All right, Miss Olivia.
Did you want a question?
Yes.
Larvey Coswald wants to know, was JFK trying to secure a deal with the Russians in order to avoid wars of UFO junk conspiracy?
Yeah, in essence, one of the reasons that he wanted to share this information is he felt that the nuclear tensions were so high that if they mistook one of these craft for one of our advanced craft, that it would be all over. Because, as we know, for some strange reason, the UFOs have this strange tendency to hang out over nuclear sites. And they had reports on that on both sides, and he was trying to think of how can we lessen those tensions. And one of the really interesting things that he did, that's a shot of him there with what has to be a really hardcore member of the space fighting domain crowd, which is Alan Dulles, who covered up many of the links of the CIA to Kennedy. And of course, Kennedy had fired. One of the interesting things in those documents, I have it here, is that he had ordered NASA and the Central Intelligence Agency. That's one of them. I mean, we don't get all the information, but we get some of the hardcore part. That's November 12th, 1963, 10 days before he's assassinated, where the subject title for the director's Central Intelligence Agency is the classification review of all UFO intelligence files affecting national security. So that's a major... I mean, he was putting this on a level where he wanted this open. He even wanted a record of it somewhere. And he says in here, quote, I'll just read from this briefly. I had discussed with you previously, I've initiated and instructed James Webb to develop a program with the Soviet Union in joint space and lunar exploration. It would be very helpful if you could have the high threat cases reviewed with the purpose of identification of bona fide as opposed to classified CIA and Air Force sources. It is important that we make a clear distinction between the knowns and unknowns in the event the Soviets may try to mistake our extended cooperation as a cover for intelligence gathering of their defense and space program. So what he's basically telling them, I need this information in order to convince them we're on the up and up. But he's telling the the head of the Central Intelligence Agency for that, and this is just now 9 days before the assassination. There is President Kennedy with Gordon Cooper, and he's really hardcore committed on what the space program is going to be. It's going to be our first representation of what we can bring to the world, how we can expand the world, freedom, give everyone an ideal. And he got that on board, but it's so antagonistic to the deep state national security state forces that it's the antithesis of what they want, which is domination. So this is how he finds himself in this situation to become assassinated in Dallas in 1963. And whenever you look at XPROTECT, you have to look at the Kennedy assassination, because that is really the linchpin event that changes everything over. And it creates the situation that we're in now. And it's interesting because, of course, this situation about the records keeps coming up with Trump, who we're going to explore in the second part of this presidential presentation here. But Trump has a lot of the same problems that Kennedy did, which is that the intelligence agencies want him acting one way when he's acting another. And this becomes a really kind of major issue. I wanted to show this also, which this one's at the Kennedy Library, actually. It's unclassified document. And I've shown it on this program in my previous Kennedy episode, but it is, if you want to look it up, it's National Security Action Memorandum number 271. And it's the memorandum for the administrator of NASA. The subject is cooperation with the USSR on outer space matters. So he's moving on this on November 12th. And he's saying that he wants him to personally take the initiative and the central responsibility within the government for the development of a program of substantive cooperation with the Russians in the field of outer space, including the development of specific technical proposals. I assume that you'll work closely with the Department of State and other agencies as appropriate, and gives them some deadlines and all the rest of it. Of course, there's an X identifier on the bottom of that page, which is not part of any other regular classification. The X tells you that he's saying we're talking about that technology. So when you're getting around the UFO file, there's always the X designation. There'll never be anything in official documents that doesn't have it, because it always needs that, so that anyone who's looking at it, the steganography is understood on different levels. And I want to explain this is because if I'm a CIA director and I've got, say, 10,000 agents out there, I can't take them all in and brief them on the level, because they all have different levels of access. But what I can do is I can have those 10,000 agents following a particular protocol around letter designation to follow a program and feed me back information based on following the letter designation. So in other words, they can get their hands on data about where that X program is going without knowing what's inside the X program. That's the way that you maintain and compartmentalize. So it makes the X steganography and the types of things that we study here in this program start to open up when we understand what this is about. Now, some people have asked me, now that you've discovered the X steganography and put out 40 episodes of it, are they going to stop using it? And the question is very important, I think. The answer is no, because X steganography's been out. They've been using it since the Egyptian mystery schools. So it's a designation that means something to them. And it always is out there for the public. They're always going to know more about that X that we see in public, SpaceX or X-37B, in relation to space in these programs, because there are so many. The predominant number of X's that you'll run into around different things in society or different programs or movies or whatever that are going to be just there because they are, it's like using any other letter. These are quite, this is the nature of this program and why they can use it so effectively, because it's all out there. It's not anything that's so unusual.
I think they don't seem to care that we know so much.
I think there's a certain amount of truth.
Yeah, at this point, there's a lot of knowledge out there, and nothing seems to change. So, they're not threatened by it.
Excellent point.
I do have a question.
Yes.
Okay.
Please.
So, Jim Roy, the heretic, wants to know, did JFK realize that the deep state aerospace industry wanted him dead before he could disclose ETs and UFOs, because they would lose all control that they still have to this very day?
Excellent question. I think that he realized he was in a battle, and that he realized he was dealing with some of the dirtiest players on the planet, and very powerful. He described certain people like J. Edgar Hoover as dangerous as a rattlesnake. That's pretty dangerous. So he understood them on these levels and what they were up to. But I think that he felt that he had the chops to outmaneuver them. And I think that we see him outmaneuvering them on a number of different situations, such as not going into Cuba and things like that. So I think that he felt he could stay ahead of the game. And unfortunately, they decided to go for all the marbles, basically. Now, I will say this about Kennedy, is that he did understand also that there were these forces out there, and he supported programs like 7 Days in May, which became a major movie based on this novel about these generals taking over and creating this incident in order to oust this kind of peace-loving president and defend the country on the nuclear front. And also The Manchurian Candidate was another one. And he let the White House be used for these things to be filmed in. So he understood what was going on there. And he also understood the pressure he was under. And let's face it, this is a guy who, although he's thought of as someone who was this millionaire playboy or whatever, he'd been in World War II. His boat was cut in half by a Japanese destroyer, and he had to swim to shore and almost lost his life, as we know. So he was no stranger to that kind of danger. And I think he understood intelligence probably better than anybody. So I think, if anything, what we have inside the Central Intelligence Agency is massive envy for him. And they don't like that they have this young upstart who's going to start telling them what to do when they've basically controlled the world up to now. They figure it's their game. Yes.
Nimza has a good point here. Are they not threatened because attention to the X makes a directed human intention to accomplish the move to space culture?
Well, that's really important. Space culture is an important term.
I like that.
Everything is moving into space. What's odd is that everything was moving into space in the 60s, right? With Ground Control to Major Tom, 2001: A Space Odyssey. That's where the culture was. And then they got arrested for 50 years, choked off. There was a period where it was also coming out in the late 70s, like the Close Encounters of the Third Kind thing around the alien contact idea. Jimmy Carter with all of his FOIA requests and letting the UFO file be accessed in terms of records and things like that. And they shut all that stuff up eventually. And then in the 90s, you have the commercial end, right, running with the X-Files and with the whole big-eyed gray thing. And there was another push there, and the Lawrence Rockefeller team looking at that. And you had incredible people like John Mack and Bud Hopkins working around this idea and really getting pretty close, I think, especially in Mack's case. And, I spoke with Mack on a number of occasions before he died. And his take on as you can see in his books, that his take on the UFO file is very, very different. It has to do literally with human consciousness, and that human consciousness interacting with another consciousness and being transformed in the process. But also the reality of those cases and working with how it impacted people's lives who were abducted very early, and how their later lives would show it in terms of emotional stress or the pressure for great accomplishment, whatever it happened to be. So there's a lot of different factors around the UFO file. So I think when we look at the X-Tech aspect of it, it's good because we get a handle on the technology. And when you get a handle on the technology, I think you start to understand the technology with the secrecy together. That's really, I think, gives us a much broader picture. But when we look at someone like Glenn, who was becoming a key point man for this moral, idealistic version of the space program, and how he's pushed over and over again, to run for president. He's senator of Ohio. He's thought of as vice president for Carter. Never quite breaks through, just like Henry Wallace never becomes President X. It seems like that force that's outside the government that is working to kind of move things in a better direction is thwarted, but it gets close on a number of different occasions. And I would say with Henry Wallace and with Glenn and with the Kennedys, it gets close. It's definitely getting close, a lot closer. Excellent question. Let's talk a little bit about comparing the blackouts, because I started the show off with the blackouts, and I'm going to round out that point here. So we had these very unusual blackouts, as I showed the transformer blowing up in Astoria. Everyone knows the story. I connected them with these other events in Louisiana, in case you're joining us late. And those events, watch some of those videos. Olivia, remind me to I'll put up a link to one of those videos in the description, actually. But I showed a picture of it. It's WDSU TV, and it's Kenner, Louisiana. Go take a look at some of those videos. So those, within 24 hours of each other, those two blow up on each other. And then we have these other very strange blackouts of 911 service through CenturyLink. And then we have the other very unusual things happen. Now let's roll the clock back. The other thing that happened was the LA Times and its news distribution network got a malware attack so that none of the newspapers got out, and ATMs shut down in Montana. All that stuff happened over basically a 72-hour period, and there was no linking by the mainstream media of any of it. And then the only stuff that we were getting from the alternative media was the junk conspiracy. So I'm a little bit concerned that we don't have a good handle on exactly what was going on there, but we will. Oh yes, we will. Okay, so let's roll the clock back to 1965. There's that blackout. 1965. But interestingly enough, in this one, James Mcdonald, who's one of the UFO researchers that XPROTECT got rid of eventually, he raises it in Congress in relation to the blackout. So let's take a look at what he had to say. Okay, and you can actually find this on Grant Cameron's website. He archived it from Life magazine. Okay, let's go into this. 1965 Northeast blackout, UFOs and the Johnson White House. At 5:16 p.m., November 9th, 1965, the Great Northeast Power blackout occurred. The commonly told story is that the failure began at the Ontario-New York border near Niagara Falls. Supposedly, a transmission line at the Niagara generating station failed, and within seconds, 5 other transmission lines became overloaded and tripped. At this point, generators began shutting down, and the entire Northeast power system became unstable and separated into isolated power systems. We saw some of this activity in the last few days. This is in 1965. That's about 50 years ago. There was a lot of evidence that showed UFO sightings being reported in connection with the New York City blackout. I will say this, that not in relation to New York so much, but out of New Orleans and that area, I've got a lot of reports of sightings that night before any of this took place. There's a lot of evidence that showed UFO sightings being reported in connection with the New York City blackout, in addition to the reported sightings prior to and during the blackout. There were reports that indicated the UFOs might actually have caused the blackout, and this is the nature of how Mcdonald gets involved. If true, this would support other historic UFO cases. Okay, even the New York Times covered the story of the sightings and even published a photo with an apparent UFO in its publication, November 19th, 1965. Evidence looking at the possible UFO New York City blackout connection was brought in front of Congress. Dr. James Mcdonald, top ufologist of the day at the University of Arizona, professor, testified on the possible UFO connection to the Northeast blackout in front of the House Committee on Science and Astronautics, July 29, 1968. Symposium on Unidentified Flying Objects, Washington, D.C. Among the congressmen who listened in was the future Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. Which, we knew that he had the answer already. But anyway, let's get into some of that testimony. The congressmen were impressed enough with the evidence that they questioned Dr. Mcdonald on his theory of UFO electromagnetic effects being able to black out huge sections of the country. This is very unusual. One exchange occurred with Representative William Ryan, a Democrat from New York City. This is the question from Ryan to Mcdonald, who's the UFO expert. Let me ask a further question in the course of your investigation and your study of UFO sightings. Have you found any cases where contemporaneously within the sighting of UFOs, there were any other events which took place which might or might not be related to the UFOs? That is, was there any Apotheum effect that came along with people just seeing a bright light? This is James Mcdonald responding. Yes, certainly there are many physical effects. For instance, in Mr. Pettis' district of New York, several people found the fillings in their mouth hurting while this object was nearby, affecting metal. But there are many cases probably on record of car ignition failure. One famous case was in Levelland, Texas in 1957. 10 vehicles were stopped within a short area, all independently in a 2-hour period. There was no lightning or thunderstorm and only a trace of rain. So they see this craft and 10 cars go out. There's another, which I don't know whether to bring to the committee's attention or not. The evidence is not as conclusive as the car stopping, but there are too many instances for me to ignore. UFOs have often been seen hovering near power facilities. There are a small number, but still a little too many to seem more fortuitous, pure fortuitous chance of system outages coincident with the UFO sighting. One of the cases was Tamara, Illinois. There are these scattered instances in which substantial power distribution systems have failed at or very near the time of observation of aerial phenomena, UFOs. So transformers breaking, power going down. These are the types of things that happen when the UFOs are spotted. So that Apotheum effect that takes place, basically, the reason that we get into such secrecy around this, and why we have that wall of secrecy in dealing with it, is that we're running smack into a different kind of physics when these things show up. And basically, for the powers that be, that's a nightmare, because they're basically looking at the situation and studying the Apotheum. But when the Apotheum happens, anybody can study it so that somebody else can get the jump on them. This is where the XPROTECT groups come in, and where we get these stories about men in black afterwards coming in during these cases to harass people or to intimidate them into silence or to really convince them. Some of them are so unusual, though, as to almost look like kind of astral projections. And this is where the work turns and gets very, very interesting, because you have to wonder what kind of an unusual effort is this to silence that type of information coming out to the public. Obviously, by this point, we understand it pretty well. It's been so integrated into the culture for us to think, but yes, to think about it in a certain way. So if we look back, there's one more quote here I'm going to give Mcdonald before we move on. So he says, quote, "I interviewed a woman in Seacliff, New York. She saw a disc hovering and going up and down and then shooting away from New York just after the power failure. I went to the FPC for data. They didn't take them seriously, although they had many dozens of sightings reports for that famous evening." So this was another New York blackout. This one was accompanied by large-scale sightings, and it took the grid down in that period of time. And it was a big case. There were reports all over New England in the midst of that 1965 blackout. 5 witnesses near Syracuse, New York, saw a glowing object ascending within about a minute of the blackout. First, they thought it was a dump burning right at the moment the lights went out. It's rather puzzling that the pulse of current that tripped the relay in Ontario in the plant has never been identified. But tentative suspicion was centered near the Niagara Mohawk network right there in the Syracuse area where all these sightings were. So the bottom line is that there's substantial background for craft showing up and these Apotheum effects taking place, like the grid being hit. So what do we have? We had the Astoria incredible transformer blowout, which blew up the sky in New York. We had the Kenner blowout in Louisiana. We had the LA Times news distribution network hit by malware across the country. And we had the CenturyLink 911 emergency services. All that happened within 72 hours. So I think that this is giving us some idea that there was something more going on with these incidents. And we have somebody like Mcdonald, who, remember, was silenced by the XPROTECT group, bringing this all up to Congress in 1965. Quite remarkable. Now, before I get into some of the things that I've covered here about the Men in Black, how are we doing out there?
We're doing great. David Donaway said, I guess there's a movie called The Trigger Effect. Did you run into this? It's from 1978, and it details the world's present dependence on complex technological networks through a detailed narrative of New York City and the power blackout of 1965.
I like it.
Mm-hmm.
I like it. I will have to check that out. I have not seen it. But I'm great at following up on those good suggestions.
Just on an odd note,
yeah.
I kind of, this creeps me out a little bit. Breach123 said all the speakers in his office, radio, and PC while waiting for the DJ show today began crackling while turned off.
Oh, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, that's pretty interesting. I've heard similar things, so it doesn't surprise me that much, but how unusual. I don't know what a good explanation for that would be, by the way. That is an actual
They
Life
say
magazine.
that even if I know this is true, even if your item is not on, if it's plugged in, there is a current going through, which is why you're using electricity and it's costing you money. So you should unplug them.
Yes.
So maybe there's something to that.
I think the idea that people have encountered within the last 3 days or so, these incredible things, and I've talked about that, the ATM disruption that I was seeing go on that day was just amazing. So all these systems at some level are interconnected, but we have on record, it's not anybody's guess, that 37 states and their emergency grid had to switch to 800 numbers because the 911 services would not work. That's a fact. So, and by the way, we got a number of emergency hits today, and friends on the West Coast, they got their emergency broadcasts on their phone, right? Those were emergency alerts. I still have mine on my phone. So the emergency services, obviously, the Century Intel link were down. The CenturyLink, all their services went down the same time. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. And the only thing that we got out of the media on that was that they let off their New York Times story saying, and CNN said, no, it wasn't aliens. Ha ha, someone tripped the wire in New York. I mean, it's kind of weird. So we're all over that story. Go ahead.
David Donaway also said that you will find the trigger effect on the brilliant series Connections by James Burke with BBC, and you will find it very eerie. So we should look into that as well.
Okay, excellent. Okay. These are great suggestions.
This story, this is not, I mean, I don't think this is going away.
Right.
Obviously, it's just too coordinated. I don't like it's very suspicious to me. And, you know, what Matt Stein and others have been talking about for years is we are very vulnerable to EMP attacks or what was that remote viewer was talking about? The solar flares.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting thing, too. And it's weird because I support all of those things, but we all, in large part, we've been desensitized from a lot of that through the type of fear porn hyper videos that we've seen about, you know, FEMA camps and false flag this and false flag that. So it's tricky terrain. What's very strange is that they seem to be doing something just the opposite in the mainstream media, which is going completely to sleep about it and being like, hey, it's a pretty blue light. So I think it's either like zombie or freaked out and afraid. Those are the two states that they know how to manage. But if we actually get some good reporting going on right down the middle, we can answer a lot about those. I know when those incidents were happening by the amount of people that I've talked to in the areas directly affected, and even what happened here and on the West Coast, that they were very unusual. And so I'm going to be looking to dig out a lot more information about that. And watch the mainstream reporting on it as it starts to kind of redirect our attention to like Nancy Pelosi or some nonsense like that.
You know what's weird about it? it's everything is reversed, right? You should have Trump derangement syndrome, right? You know, and be terrified of Putin and all this. You know, these things they hype you up with all of this stuff,
right?
That isn't worthy. And then something like this, even the most legitimate cause for concern, right? That the grid needs to be upgraded, right? No, it's just aliens.
Yeah, I mean, okay, they were very concerned about the Russians interfering with the voting system. They're like, oh my God. But you have large-scale explosions of transformers that affect millions of people, and you don't care, and you don't think about it in terms of the Russians doing it. I mean, you know, it's very unusual. But certainly it's some kind of cyber attack. And there have been some wild suggestions all over the place about it. And, you know, I'm not somebody, like I said over and over again on this program, you know, we bring the information and the facts together. And it's not something where we'll ever rely on buzzwords or junk conspiracy. The thing is, though, when we get into a situation where the mainstream media is ignoring the real implications of the things that are happening in a pattern, then we have to wonder what it is that's really going on and forget about the junk conspiracy aspect that'll get thrown in with that, you know, like, oh, it's an alien alert or whatever. You know, let's look at what was actually going on there. And if there was UFO activity, let's track it directly to the incidents that happened. We can learn a lot that way, as they did in 1965. I did want to touch on a couple of things here. One of them has to do with what Trump is doing. So I'm going to take this whole file here. Now, Trump, in case a lot of very interesting things have happened to President Trump in the last month. And he's getting more and more heavily identified with the Space Force. And but something that's very unusual about the Space Force that Trump announced is there's no way that he can get a Space Force without Congress, 2/3 of Congress on board. So it becomes a very unusual thing to say, I'm going to announce a Space Force, because as president, you can't do it. So therefore, and it takes years to get that through Congress. So what is it that he's positioning for? Trump understands something very special in relation to the space aspect, that by declaring it a war-fighting domain, as he's trying to do, which you can't do because we're under 1968 treaties, not to do that. By the way, he pulled us out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which was a horrible decision brought on by the likes of John Bolton, who had worked in George W. Bush's he was his UN ambassador. It's a terrible advisor. It just needs to be thrown out of the White House. But that type of activity, which lends itself to us building up nukes all over again. I mean, what is this, 1988? You know, I think we've already seen that movie. But I will say this about what Trump is doing in relation to the space aspect, which if he can stick to the idea of the executive branch getting the autonomy over the space program again, instead of having this strange, shadowy deep state aspect have the upper hand on it with the black budget money and all the rest of it, that would be worthwhile. Instead, using it as war talk is a terrible idea, and it's getting a really bad reaction from the Russians. But nonetheless, during this period of time now, Trump he's got a new defense secretary. This guy's very, very interesting. I'm going to come up with his bio again. But one of the things I want to point out, that's Trump with his new secretary, is that Mad Dog Mattis, who was the defense secretary for the first 2 years under the Bush administration, under the Trump administration, it also has a weird connection to Luis Elizondo and that whole Elizondo, John Brennan, Drone King thing. So I think when Trump dismisses Mattis, he may be throwing that whole kind of junk disclosure group out. And by moving this guy in, this guy has a very interesting background, including the fact that he went to MIT, where Professor John Trump, who's Donald's uncle, was there for many years. And he was the protege of Vannevar Bush. Vannevar Bush ran the UFO file, as we know, through the work of Robert Sarbarker, who was the physicist who came out and said that to UFO researchers, who I've shown in this program has been largely whitewashed out of history. There is my most recent attempt to get his Wikipedia page. That one's today. And it's Robert Sarbarker, and it says, the page Robert Sarbarker, the person, doesn't exist. There is no Robert Sarbarker. But as we know, if you want to find Miley Cyrus in Wikipedia, you'll find her. Sarbarker was one of the biggest physicists in American history. He was right up there with Oppenheimer and all the rest of it. For him not to exist in this new digital information world with a Wikipedia page is beyond absurd. You have to understand the reason that they would keep someone like Sarbarker out is because he said, yes, there was a UFO file program for, basically figuring out this technology, redeveloping it, and seeing what it was made of. So therefore, because he came out and said that to researchers who had tracked him down in retirement in Florida, he died shortly after that. But Sarbarker is very, very important because he was deep, deep in the system. And he identified, forget about MJ-12 documents and all that stuff. May be true, may not be true. That doesn't matter. Sarbarker identified Vannevar Bush, who appears in those documents, as the person who was running the UFO file. That's important. He's on record saying it. Physicist Sarbarker said that the leadership of the UFO file went from Bush to Arthur Compton to John von Neumann. That's an important troika of figures that give us a lot to cover in the X series as we've done. But you see how this is an important missing piece in history, and the way to keep it missing is to keep people like Sarbarker out of the real history thing and to just reference him. Oh yeah, he was teaching at Harvard before he retired. So if you can't get him in Wikipedia, then, nowadays, that's really how people get a lot of information, even though we know it's compromised. So keeping him out is quite crucial. The question always becomes, when you're looking at things on the X Steganography level, it's what's left out. So if he's left out of Wikipedia, there's good reason for it. Let's take a quick look at what he said that was so important and why the XPROTECT group got rid of that information. Now, I've pointed out before that Bill Steinman, who was a UFO researcher and a real pain in the neck, apparently, for tracking down information.
Thank goodness.
Exactly. He was the kind of guy who could really go out there and bang the drum and get information. And he has an incredible book that came out, I think it's about 1990, and I have a copy of it here, the full edition, called UFO Crash at Aztec. And he went in and talked to some of these major figures. But he went after Sar Barker with some letters saying that I want to talk to you about this. And basically, at a certain point, he wrote a letter kind of giving up, saying, well, you know, I'm not sure why you won't talk to me about this, but I can appreciate the secrecy and all the rest. Oddly enough, Sar Barker wrote him back on official stationery and told him plenty. And then I have just a few excerpts I want to read from Sar Barker. Sar Barker wrote him letters, and then we had UFO researchers following up for conversations. So one of the most important ones is when we had Stanton Friedman had a conversation with him shortly before he died, and he said, quote, this is a question. So, Friedman, I was told they had recovered a UFO with some people in it. Sar Barker said, I had to run my own business, my laboratory, and I couldn't go to all the meetings. They did have, at least I was told, that's when Carl Compton was down there. So Carl Compton and his brother, Arthur Compton, who are Nobel Prize-winning physicists. Okay. So Friedman said, so what happened? And Sar Barker says, I was told they had recovered a UFO with some people in it. Okay, this is the 1980s, but it's a big thing to put on the record if you're one of the biggest physicists in history. And Sar Barker says, I don't know. That's what I was told. And Friedman says, did he tell you where? Well, we were having a meeting at Wright Field, and I couldn't go. But later on, one of the fellows said to me that those guys, if they were people, were made like insects. They didn't have any skin in their bodies. So they were saying that's how they were able to accelerate and decelerate without being torn apart. You see, if we were going 1,000 miles a second and stopped in a minute, well, we would be squished. So they go on. So basically, not only is he accepting the fact, saying, well, here's how the UFO file ran, here's who worked on the crash retrieval programs, and here's what was going on with it. He actually says to him, here's what they were studying, and they had beings and all the rest of it. So he's really letting the cat out of the bag, which is why he has to be rubbed out of history, and actually rubbed out by XPROTECT. Now, in one of the documents from 1950, which Canadian researcher Wilbur Smith put forward, he talked to Sar Barker then, and Sar Barker said, and this is Friedman reading, that his response, Sar Barker said, yes, it's classified 2 points higher even than the H-bomb. In fact, the most highly classified subject in the U.S. government at the present time. That's the UFO file in 1950. Okay, so here we are some almost 70 years later. So if that's the nature of the beast back then, how major, how vast has that secrecy grown? It's incredible. Now, what's interesting is Sar Barker says, I don't have the slightest idea why it's still classified. It's very unusual. It's almost nonchalant. But this could be something passive-aggressive about Sar Barker in relation to this, that he did not want this to be something that they had a justification for. So he didn't go the whole route of like, these guys are at war or whatever. He just says, I don't know why it's classified still. Ask them. It's ridiculous.
Well, it's interesting because it begs the question how scientists' minds work differently from the elite, right?
Yes. Right. He's just a classic scientist trying to move the ball down the forward, move the culture, and get the whole thing going.
So even he, with all of his brilliance, doesn't understand how the elites think.
Right.
Their priorities, their motivations.
And we're starting to learn now. Everyone, you're watching Dark Journalist, and I want to. It's great to have everyone here for our New Year's broadcast.
It is a huge crowd tonight.
It's gigantic, and it's fabulous to have everyone here. Of course, we're going to be back on Friday night, our usual 7 o'clock slot, but we had to be with you for New Year's after we hope you had very, very happy holidays. And we're going deep into XPROTECT and what happened here in relation to this program of the UFO file and the X technology. I think what we've seen is that Sar Barker's admission coming forward creates a schism. It creates a problem for those people who are still working on the secrecy end. And I think that's where you see a lot of weird, erratic efforts in the late 80s and early 90s to kind of roll out this, gray talking, the gray confession or the alien autopsy and all that kind of junk end of it. Because I think we were getting maybe somewhere a fundamental basis to get closer. Okay. One interesting thing that he says before they turn the recorder off is that he gets the question, who else was involved besides Vannevar Bush? Okay, because Vannevar Bush was the head of the program for 9 years. That's important. Well, after Bush left, somebody else came in. Carl Compton, as we already described. Compton took it over, and then von Neumann took it over from him. And then they asked questions, Carl Compton and you? And he goes, no, wait a second. No, Bush was the head and the scientific advisory to the president. His official job, he was also director of the Carnegie Foundation. That's quite important information about Bush. Then Compton came down from MIT, and there's MIT again. Out in New Mexico, so he's talking about a little bit of who the guys were that were involved, and he goes into saying that also Oppenheimer was there, and also those guys being New Mexico in 1947, one has to presume Oppenheimer and Groves and those guys were involved. Okay, so we get kind of a wide angle lens there in looking at Sar Barker being rubbed out of history and giving us this information. It's kind of the most solid information on the record in relation to the UFO file and gives us the foundation to fill in the missing piece. Now, the question is, we've got a fellow who's just been appointed the director, the Secretary of Defense, taking over for Mattis, who was didn't like Trump's idea of getting out of Syria and decided to basically resign in protest. Well, the New York Times ran an editorial and they said, Trump has taken away the whole debate about the war in Syria. It's like, look, when a president takes troops out of an area, that's a good thing. Okay, so you don't need a debate. If the president wants to take the troops out, then the troops come out. What's the debate for? Should we leave troops in? Syria's been a disaster. That's how the deep state raises a country to the ground. And if you've ever seen real hardcore pictures of what has happened to Syria since that civil war and our activities in there, there's nothing good about our presence in Syria. And the fact is that according to Consortium News, and I want to get this on the record, and I will go deeper with this, Consortium News has now let out an article that a John Kerry tape has been leaked, saying that they knew during the Obama administration that their efforts to topple the leadership in Syria were helping ISIS directly. So, often when they go off and they say Secretary of State Clinton, and John Kerry had actually created ISIS and supported it. Well, he inasmuch confirmed it. They had their own strategic reasons for doing that they wanted to take the Syrian leadership out. But they, in essence, helped fuel this murderous gang ISIS. Now, I find that very interesting because ISIS, as we know, has gone around not only taking over land and doing all these savage things, but destroying monuments and looking for artifacts and things like that. So I think there's a very strange backdoor channel we're going to see in those archaeology wars in relation to what we're speaking about with Consortium News and this leak of a John Kerry tape. We're going to be all over that. Let's take a quick look at this gentleman's project. You notice this very interesting project by the new Secretary of Defense is a Boeing 777X. Now, this is a very interesting project for this guy to be involved in, and I'm going to tell you why in a minute. But Olivia, why don't you go ahead and give me a question?
Don Devine is asking a question I don't know about. Have you heard about the CIA New Knowledge Connection?
New Knowledge Connection.
Yeah, New Knowledge in quotes, so it's a term.
Oh, that's a new program?
Mm-hmm.
No, you can send me any information in relation to that at info@darkjournalist.com. I'd love to hear it.
Okay, the other question is, this always comes up when you bring up Vannevar Bush.
Yes.
Any relationship to the Bush family? And
well, we haven't found one on record, but I'll tell you this, Vannevar Bush, he was the mentor to John Trump. That's the thing to keep in mind with him. So that's an incredibly deep level of influence on Trump. And he had Trump in his rad lab there at MIT. The rad lab is basically how we won World War II. But the rad lab also controlled the UFO file. And John Trump and his mentor, Vannevar Bush, ran it. So how knowledgeable is Trump on this factor? Very, very knowledgeable. So Patrick Shanahan, the new Secretary of Defense, this 777X Boeing is one of the projects that he was the lead on when he was there. The X tie-in with him and this advanced craft that they're just now showing it getting going, we have to keep in mind that Shanahan is a very advanced player over here. And by the way, he also went to MIT. So the idea of an overlap with him and John Trump is very important. And we're going to go deeper into that. This is a look at that Boeing 777X. It is the largest passenger plane. And they're just rolling it out for 2019. Quite fascinating indeed, but I think it shows right off the bat that Shanahan has a deep grasp of that advanced technology along the X side, and that Trump's appointment of him as defense secretary over Mattis, who again, remember, was associated with Elizondo and the John Brennan drone king under Obama, the CIA director. We kind of see the lines there, which is, if we can really separate it out, you've got Clinton hugging up to the Elizondo, Tom DeLonge, Podesta disclosure thing. They were going to do their weird alien attack scenario. Then we have on the other side the Space Council, the Space Force, all these things that Trump is reaching for without congressional approval. And in the middle of that, we have all these private developers like Branson, like Elon Musk, and like Bigelow vying for all of the pie that's up there in space. And then we have the unusual things that are out there related to the UFO file. So it's quite an interesting scenario, and there's quite a lot of pushing back and forth for influence. But I think what is most important, especially when we look at the Men in Black and things of that nature, that the XPROTECT group is always set up there to silence any good research by discrediting it, as in the case of Jim Garrison in the 60s, or, we saw a lot of earlier researchers like Morris Jessup, like Mcdonald, suicided. So I do feel that we're running into a period where, because of Trump's move on the space side and because of the presence of people like Shanahan, and then looking at the other side with the Elizondo type people and that whole thing that kind of went down, I think we're looking at a dangerous situation where they really don't want the Trump side to get their hands on that technology. And so I think the XPROTECT thing is a very important thing for us to keep our eye on in relation to this. I think it forms a massive factor of the geopolitical situation that we see going on. And by the way, it's not just going on in relation to space. And that's one of the reasons that we've been really emphasizing this Atlantis rising theme in the episodes lately, because there's a landmass off of the East Coast by Cuba that's rising. And this was predicted down through the mystery schools. And now we have physical evidence of this happening. And we have all of these stories of the Hemingway family originally being involved over 3 generations. And a lot of intel pressure basically to get them out of the picture there. So I think these things are important. Of course, on John Lennon's birthday, we spelled out that he was trying to buy up lots in the Atlantic Ocean for this stuff to rise. There seems to be some kind of an inside thing for these people on the inside track who have the money and the knowledge to use this esoteric information to somehow profit from this new Atlantis and Atlantis rising scenario. And we've gone deep into Paulina Zalitsky's discovery of this entire city off of Cuba under the water there. So something remarkable is taking place in relation to how we look at the UFO file 1, this battle over the Space Force, and this whole scenario about Atlantis rising 2. This is where the heart of our discussion needs to go. And with that, Miss Olivia, I'm going to turn it over to you and your questions.
Okay, starting off with Zach Gerard.
Yes.
What is XPROTECT in a sentence?
XPROTECT is a system that protects the UFO file information from getting out because it's classified higher than nuclear secrets. And it's not just protecting information about off-world civilizations visiting. I think that's a totally different kind of security. But it's protecting this Apotheum, or guarding this Apotheum effect, because that kind of runaway physics, I think it's in Joseph Farrell's term, when he speaks about the bell, he says it makes the atomic bomb look like a firecracker. Reality distortion is pretty heavy duty. And that's why the mystery schools held that X after the Atlantis destruction, because they wanted to make sure that humanity didn't get their hands on that again till they were ready and that developed enough character to handle it. And we'll see if in fact that has taken place yet here in the 21st century. Okay.
Yeah, there's something about consciousness. That's what it really is all about.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
well,
Fred
so much of
Cameron
this
thinks that too. I mean,
well, yeah, go ahead.
Well, just so many researchers, the longer you're in it. Jacques Vallée, right? You start to realize it's not that things aren't physical. They're not made up of physical matter, but the real secret is about consciousness. And that's unlocking our potential.
Yeah, I do think that when you stick to just a nuts and bolts aspect, look, the mystery school thing is very telling, and that's why we emphasize the mystery schools so much on this show. The traditions that we have of the public mystery schools, like Theosophy, like the Rudolf Steiner anthroposophy movement, they form a link, the Gurdjieff schools, they form a link to a deep tradition of knowledge that's been kept since pre-dynastic Egyptian times and held all the way through the Templars, all the way through the Rosicrucians, and the Hermetic unveiling of this information. So they've given us what we can handle. Of course, Steiner has always referred to this important date, 1840, where something took place that the mystery schools made a decision that with the onslaught of scientific materialism, they had to roll out more information for us. This might become a kind of a date like a 1776 date if we can start to wrap our heads around the importance of what took place there, because I would say that that period seems to have defined our modern era more than almost anything else. Of course, we have these incredible technological advances, but a lot of that really came as a result of the mystery schools giving us something to work with to buffer against just the pure scientific materialism. Now, the question is, can we balance the advances with our spirituality and humanity? That always has been the challenge in the past, and that's why the legends that Plato gave us of Atlantis ring so echo so heavily today. Absolutely.
Right.
Wow. Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
So Nimsa says, from whom does XPROTECT ultimately take orders?
Well, what's interesting is apparently, and Jim Garrison found this out, which is that power apparently resides somewhere deep in the aerospace companies themselves. Now, we know that there was a head fake toward this during Howard Hughes' period, in that he was a billionaire. He had an aerospace company. He worked with the CIA. So it was these groups that are inside and outside of government. They don't necessarily reside in just the intelligence services. They don't necessarily reside in just the corporate dominance, but it's some blending there of these forces. But I think the best way to describe the members of XPROTECT and their actions is more like an astral agency, because they don't seem to take on very human characteristics. And I'm not going to call them aliens either. As a matter of fact, John Keel, who did the most research around the Men in Black, and we've done programs on this, and what he decided, he kept a number of characteristics of different race groups with him so that he could show the people who had seen these Men in Black characters and these suspicious characters who showed up after UFO incidents. And over again, they picked out these members of the Sami people who live in northern Sweden and in Finland and have an incredible tradition there of mysticism, like deep ceremonial magic. And these Laplanders, as Keel called them, I understand that the term itself is very interesting because it's Keel's term about them, but I think it's seen in some quarters as a derogatory term.
It's too bad because it's a fantastic term.
Well, Lapland is one of the names.
It's just a pretty word.
I think it became part of a thing because they were native tradition, and I think there was almost like a Native American battle with this. But we have, of course, it's incredibly beautiful people. I mean, Renee Zellweger is Sami, and so they've come a long way through many eons. I mean, here's just a remarkable culture, but they are known and they have this background. It was often said in the Middle Ages that Sweden had won all these wars in relation to having used the magic of the Laplanders. So the picture that Keel kept with him, that's another very fascinating face there. This is a very interesting, important picture of the Laplander tribes around 1920. Very indigenous people, very close to the land, very cognizant, very intuitive, highly psychic individuals. But the photo that Keel had that he used was actually a female Laplander, and she had this look, and that people had mistaken this look for being Asian, which is why they described over and over again these Men in Black characters as being Asian. But this was the picture that they picked out over and over again as across the board, far more than when he showed them other pictures of Asians or Islanders or Spanish people or Americans or whatever. So the Laplanders have an important history and tradition. I've gone through it, and we're going to go more into that, how the Sami people have this incredible mystical background that's part of their heritage. And it's really quite fascinating, and I hope to learn a lot more about it.
Christine Taggart, who of course is part native, says the Samis are related to the Iroquois. I didn't know that.
Oh, that's interesting. Totally different parts of the world. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's through some DNA testing. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you one thing that's very interesting about the astral agency idea. Over and over again, one of the people who is like a real celebrity who's encountered the Men in Black is Dan Aykroyd, believe it or not. I know it sounds sensationalist. I know he's been associated with like Ghostbusters and all kinds of movies in the past, but he takes a great interest in the UFO aspect, and he had done a series for Sci-Fi and put together these 12 episodes for them, looking into these various cases, like Gulf Breeze and all these very controversial cases that had taken place on the UFO side. Interestingly enough, he found himself in a tough situation where they canceled the series out of the blue after he had filmed all of this. And he actually encountered these men in black who looked very classically like they had come out of the 1950s with the long limousine and all the rest of it. And he was convinced that they were not ordinary in that sense. So this idea of an astral agency, and if we combine that with what we know about some of those traditions about the Sami people, I think it is quite fascinating, because when we look at some of the lore and history from that period, we see that they're well respected for those abilities. And there may have been a point of time where the intelligence agencies exploited that. So that's something that we're going deep on. But obviously, Keel got a major breakthrough there, and it was missed by a lot of people. But I always thought it was fascinating, and I've done a lot of research on it. I think astral agency, that is a group that can operate physically from an astral projection, is a great explanation for how weird the Men in Black act.
Breach 123 was asking, are Iroquois Atlantean? Christine Taggart answered yes.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And of course, Casey
that comes from the Casey readings.
Right.
Casey said that the Atlanteans were a red race, that they were basically the Native Americans, and that the purest, what came closest to the purest Atlantean were the Iroquois Indians. And by the way, we got a large piece of our own constitution from the Founding Fathers' fascination with the Iroquois Confederacy. So something very advanced was going on there. Okay, we'll take a couple more questions. I want to remind everyone.
You mean a couple? I have 2 hours.
Don't worry, we're coming back Friday, but I do want you to keep them, though. Maybe we'll start with those questions. And it's great to be here with everyone. And we've got, of course, Olivia here doing some great questions from you. Ask your questions in caps. I forgot to say that. My apologies, Miss Olivia.
That's okay. They're trained now.
It's fantastic to have everyone here. What a fantastic crowd. And I want to let everyone know that we have an amazing array of shows coming up for you in January and February. And it's going to take the X series episodes to a whole new level. And we're really laying the foundation here, but we're getting into some deep territory. And it's very, I think we're going to look at that foundation of the first 40 episodes of the series as really giving us a place to move from. And we've kind of created the education and the understanding so that some of the revelations that come out this year, we're really going to lock into those together. Before I move on from Shanahan, I do want to say this also, that the switch from Mattis to Shanahan, which wasn't going to take place until March, by the way, is now in effect. It took place early, so there's a reason for that too. So let's keep that in mind, and we'll go deeper with this next question.
Cheryl B, why do other countries keep UFOs secret?
Well, I believe there's a general secrecy agreement, but certainly France, for example, let out the Cometa report, and I think that's 2009 now. That's a while ago. And they're totally on the record. They let out all the cases, and they came to the conclusion that there was something going on there in terms of an off-world civilization invading the space. Those were scientists. Okay, other countries are more advanced on this. There's no question about it. The Russians are more advanced on it. We're more advanced on it secretly, but in terms of public discourse on it, we're really behind the 8 ball. I think we understand it on the marketing level. We know how to talk about it from the marketing side and from the entertainment side. And I think in this, that there's a big role to be played by the new media, by the independent media coming forward, because a lot of the alternative voices out there don't cover, except for using the alien thing as kind of a buzzword, or Nibiru as a buzzword on a YouTube video or something. You know, we need to go deeper. And that's why I think this would be a fantastic year for us to apprehend the good information, to get behind the good sources of information, and to really get rid of a lot of the junk conspiracy, a lot of the dancing galactic ambassadors, a lot of the phony DeLong, TTSA, Elizondo front. That's not where it's at. And we're not getting anything from those people except promises of more things to buy. Okay, so they want to control the narrative and drain your wallet simultaneously. It's like a two-pronged process. So I think that we can really wake up in the middle of all this and find ourselves surrounded by great people and great information. I just heard a fantastic presentation from Nomi Prinz, who we've had on the show before, and we're going to have back in 2019, telling us about the influence of the Federal Reserve and the central bank strategy. And we have the information out there, and there's no excuse for wasting our time on the junk conspiracy, the third force distraction stuff. I say we really go for the good stuff. Forget about the flat Earth thing, and forget about the blue, and galactic ambassadors and things like that. Let's get on to the good stuff. Okay.
Najat Madri, any relation to the stopping of the space program in the 70s, the missing 21 trillion, and the breakaway civilization?
Yes. Well, it's interesting, breakaway civilization. Isn't that one of those terms now that has been bandied about so much? It's kind of been sitchened out, right? It's one of those. It's just like when they used to say Anunnaki. It was used so much that it lost a lot of its power. But I think the fundamental idea of a breakaway civilization is very sound, actually, because what happens is if you get into these circles, like the circle that John Trump and Vannevar Bush were in, you start to make scientific discoveries. And in science, we know that the way it works is one guy makes a discovery and the next scientist bounces off that. But if you interrupt that process, then this whole group of scientists is working on one level and you're working up here with advanced medicine, advanced science, advanced technology, and all the rest of it. So I feel like fundamentally, when things go dark in the 1970s, it's because they go black. And it has to do with an episode that we did here that I highly recommend. Let's see if I thought I had it out here, which is about the Nixon time capsule with the whistleblower Robert Merritt. Robert Merritt is a very significant whistleblower because he was part of the Houston plan, which is still largely classified. And when I spoke to Robert, and we released his testimony in February, which is Valentine's Day of 2018, it was really, it's quite a breakthrough in that Nixon had given him information that he had hidden information in a time capsule related to this advanced UFO technology that was going to make America energy independent. And I think originally, as we've gone back through that information, that Nixon was going to run for a third term, apparently, and he was planning on using this new energy as a way to do that. And they were going to do the entire redevelopment at Pine Gap. Now, instead, what we got was Nixon thrown out of office and the leader of Pine Gap, unceremoniously yanked by the Governor General on the Queen's order. So we can see there are a lot of forces involved when we get in there. And I do feel like it's a breakthrough when we look at Merritt's information about Nixon's time capsule, because we get a snapshot so that when we see the space program basically go silent in the 70s, except for, Voyager and things like that have nothing to do with manned missions, then we see the reasons start to add up here with the time capsule aspect and the program going black. They're developing a whole different space infrastructure, and it's completely off the books. I've pointed out before that they use the continuity of government rules, which allow for ultimate secrecy when they do that. And originally, those continuity of government rules applied just to what was going on underneath, underground. But by the time you got into the 60s and 70s, they could apply that same thing into space. And so that's where you get the massive secrecy and the money disappearing. Of course, Catherine Austin Fitts has found the 21 trillion missing from the DoD and HUD. So that's her research. And, together with the professor. So,
and
the
that's,
two of them
I
together.
have to say, what have we done about it? Right? Have we marched? Are we protesting? No. So this is why they don't care what we know.
Here's
because
something.
we know.
Professor Mark Skidmore from Ohio State did get on board with Fitz, and he sent his team to investigate her numbers, and they came up with the 21 trillion figure after her 20 years of research in the DoD and HUD. So we have that figure hanging out there. So I'd say that that's good because now it's part of the conversation. That's crucial. So that much is done. In terms of what is going to happen as a result of that we know this money is missing, I think there's going to be a kind of perfect storm of the Space Force grasping on one hand, the phony disclosure on the other, the kind of Elizondo, TTSA corporate thing, which really that particular move has gone down. They're going to try something else, though, I'm sure. And then that in combination with research like this coming up about the 20 trillion missing, it's going to make it clear that somehow there's a mechanism that transfers that money from the black budget into NASA. And that's money that, of course, we've spent. And NASA makes this. The regular NASA budget, by the way, is below 1965 levels. It's completely starved out. But what they've done is they've poured all this infrastructure into space, and now space is getting privatized on one hand, and they're creating that space fence grid on the other. So it's a pretty grim situation in terms of what we have paid for and in terms of what we get. So it seems to me the space fence information, along with the missing money, and along with the Space Force aspect, it's like a perfect storm of things for 2019. And by the way, I think that they're going to try the whole Trump, they're going to try the impeach Trump thing as a distraction from all that. But that's where the action's at. Okay, keep rolling. Sorry.
So yeah, I'll actually bring that up right now. Richard Martin wants to know, is this all this disruption telegraphing the impending attempted assassination of President Trump?
Well, I never like to project that, but I would say this. I feel like XPROTECT uses assassination. We've seen it, that they've done that. I mean, it started off that way with President Kennedy, but we've seen them use it before that as well. Assassination, I think, is what they turn to when they can't get it any other way. So I think that they'll try the any other way first. But XPROTECT tends to move in when it's a space concern, when it relates to that secret that's 2 steps higher than the atomic bomb. So that's when we see them in action, and they are, as we've seen, Donald Kehoe referred to them as the silence group. Those are some dirty players, and they will do anything to keep their secrecy wall. So I think that Trump has to be very much aware of it. But he has also concerns just within his battle with the deep state. So the move into space, he might think, gives him the security that they won't be able to do something political like this to him. But I would say watch for impeachment in 2019 as a major theme. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Right. Thomas Friedman put that article
out.
He
telegraphed that in his article in the New York Times, which is absurd. But Thomas Friedman is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So the CFR is completely controlled, and they control the media. And if you don't do what they say, then you're out. You don't get those big jobs at like the New York Times and all the rest of it. But what he said, he recommended impeaching Trump because it was good for the world. He didn't have a good reason, why to impeach Trump. And I think the article is a disgrace. But that's the kind of thing that they're going to use, this mentality of impeach him because we want to. And so that's the arrogance of the establishment versus Trump. And what Trump has done at the end of the year, I think is wise, is replacing Mattis is wise, and replacing the mentality of war by pulling the troops out of Syria, signaling cooperation with Russia. And the trick is, if they can de-escalate from what they did 2 bad things last year, in my opinion, the Trump administration. One, withdrawing from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. It's an absurd decision, beyond absurd. They have to get back in there. Obviously, that is is really bad advice. Let's put it that way. And I think the other thing that they did was to, I understand that the Iran deal was bad, but they didn't replace it with anything, and they just took it out there. So that's both, those are John Bolton moves. And so I think if we can push John Bolton out of the White House, then we have a much better shot at Trump doing what he promised. Absolutely. Okay, keep rolling.
Okay, so
yes.
Where do I want to go? How many do we have left?
Okay, no, shoot, keep rolling. Okay,
off topic. Okay, Gary Beaumont. What does DJ think of the Bush funeral letters?
Hey, I'm thinking of that Jeffrey Beaumont.
I know.
What are you doing in my apartment, Jeffrey Beaumont? That's a line from a David Lynch film. I can't think what it was. So I'm sorry. What's the question again?
The Bush letters, the Bush funeral letters that everybody's gossiping about.
Oh yeah, absolutely. One interesting analysis that I heard on that, which was from Catherine Austin Fitts, the former housing secretary, who's coming back on the show in January, by the way. And she, what she said was that Trump had made a deal with the Bushes, which is why he had appointed a former Bushie as attorney general. And so therefore the Bushes aren't going to get prosecuted, but the Clintons will be. And that therefore a lot of that bitterness there, which is, we've never seen bitterness like that displayed in a public thing between public officials. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous at a funeral, the way that the Clintons dealt with the sitting president, Trump. It was absurd. But, you know, in any case, I do feel like that was the really important thing that was going on there. The thing that they popped around, obviously somebody was playing magical notes there, and the looks on some people's faces were quite ironic. But I tend to trust Fitz on that one. If the Bushes and the Trumps have some deal going on, and that the deal is basically that the Clintons are the ones who are going to get grilled, somebody's going to get grilled in that mix. And by the way, they're not going to get sent on a barge to Gitmo. So let's get on with the real thing. Okay.
David Tormina, DJ, do you think there's anything good we can do with a space fence?
No. No. Lockheed Martin has a long history of authoritarian and incredible blackmail and incredible blocking of giving records. Secretary Fitz, actually, when she was housing secretary, tried to get information from those groups about where, and she found out an odd thing when she was trying to get HUD records, that Lockheed Martin controlled that. And in many circles of informed people, we know that the term United States of Lockheed Martin is used. Lockheed Martin was one of the aerospace companies that Jim Garrison identified as part of the XPROTECT circle. So, no, I mean, Lockheed is about the worst. But I will say this for the space fence, which is the thing that they have going on for it, which is saying that they're accumulating space junk and all the rest of it. I guarantee you the story there is that they're going to somehow convert that into, there's a killer asteroid coming and we have to beef up the space fence. That seems to be where they're going with it. That would be my guess.
Okay. On that note, Jim Roy the Heretic said,
yes.
Von Braun told Carol Rosin at Fairchild Industries that the final plan for world control would be a fake alien invasion. Are space fence and 5G the final infrastructure for this?
5G is a bridge too far. We've seen this overreach before with corporate America. And I think that this has to become almost a domestic question, which is, what are you going to tolerate? So they're going to try to keep this whole thing like, hey, it's okay to live near a nuclear plant. So what if you have 3 arms? It's not that big a deal. So they're going to do that with 5G too, which is, it hasn't been proven, you know, just because half your family is afflicted with these strange diseases suddenly, since we've been using these mini radiation towers. This is a lot about technological competition. And I think that just like, you know, the smart meters and things like that, there's an attempt to make everything into this kind of digital totalitarian rule, and that this is the way to do it. So I would say that 5G is certainly the next step in what they're doing there. But it does become a domestic question because that's something you have to deal with domestically on your street. And so that's something that you can pressure your local officials over. And I think that this is a place, you see what happens with the corporations is they get together at Davos and they sit down there and they have those meetings thinking that they're on top of everything. And they have people like Jeff Bezos hanging out and thinking that he's, the king of the world, basically. And they feed each other this fantasy that they can do anything they want. And they have basically conspired to create the next step of efficiency, which is this thing, but they haven't, they're ignoring all the health implications of this incredibly radical technology, and the health implications from every normal aspect look terrible. So it's a disastrous idea, and the Davos crowd needs to wise up, or it's going to be a very rude awakening, I think, in the end.
There's someone in the chat room named Carol Casa who says that, I guess she's in the know, 5G, a lot less physical but more mental disease.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, we can see, I'd like to see some studies on people's attitudes and emotions after being exposed to it, for sure. And they have put one close by here to our studio, so that's problematic. So if I start getting edgy, you'll let me know.
Space Coast wants to know, will the Space Force ensure that we view first contact through the military lens?
Yes.
And Phase Templar says the Space Force is to tackle the space fleet. The Vatican's Lucifer telescope is monitoring as it heads our way. What do you know about that?
Well, it's all very interesting. Well, because I mentioned Bezos, by the way, I'm going to show his picture here with a huge X on Wired magazine. Just to let you know, as he talks about space, he's looking for the X. The Space Force, you are going to be able to spin a lot. See, what's going to happen is if you have a lot of space tourism out there, there's going to be a lot of people who go out there and they're going to see these craft whizzing around, whatever you want to attribute those craft to. So therefore, they know that if they want to do this, there's going to be a lot more word of mouth about these craft. So how are they going to handle that? You can't, the secrecy is going to be harder and harder to maintain. So they've rolled out kind of weak examples of what they're going to do. But I do feel like, ATIP was like a weird thing to bring out. Elizondo, that whole phony CIA story that they came up with, that was one attempt at spinning this and then running it through Congress, developing a program where they could get national security money and funding to research metamaterials or whatever it is. So, and they included the threat idea in there. So that let us know, that gave us an idea where they were coming from. On Trump's end, making space a warfighting domain, that is, it's a way for him to kind of short circuit a lot of things that he needs to do to develop a regular space force, but it's against treaty. So it's going to hit a huge brick wall, in my opinion. And the Russians have already said that it's a disastrous idea. And I agree with that, actually. So we have to find a way to build international cooperation in space. You can't go out there and be a cowboy with that. In terms of what they're trying to do, and the Lucifer telescope, keeping an eye on the space fleet, that's pretty interesting. I'll tell you, I'll go back to Norm Berggren again, which is, he had the data in the 80s that showed that there were large-scale craft in these rings, and that he felt that we were now getting rings in relation to Uranus, and we were getting rings in terms of Jupiter. So I think that now, since he's passed away, someone can pick up the torch of that research about those rings and examine them and see if there are off-world craft in relation to that situation. It seems to me, from the national security perspective, they certainly were already doing that. Okay,
so I did want to ask these questions because I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce this. Is it Tula or Thule? The Ultima Thule?
Tula Society?
Yeah.
Thule.
Oh, yeah, exactly. So there are a bunch of questions about this. So Brenda Fisher wants to know your thoughts on the Ultima Thule or Tula object and the fact that they chose this name for it. Cliff High said, who was in the chat earlier, it's a remnant and seems to be known to be or have been inhabited. And there's a lot more interesting little
Wow, well, that's pretty interesting. I have to examine the justification that they have for naming this, which I think is quite unusual. We had the weird incident with Greenland and how they had a military base out there named Thule. So there's something going on with the kind of resurgence of this name that I think is quite fascinating. And we're going to dig in for more answers with that. I'm going to get Joseph Farrell on that one because no one knows the Tula Society info better than Farrell.
Fantastic.
Fantastic. Last question, Miss Olivia.
For
tonight.
Last question. Oh, God. Do I do it? Okay. Well, here, I wanted to ask these earlier. So Nimza again said, it seems like XPROTECT is an occult murder incorporated. Perhaps it's a group that uses various kinds of mercenaries, rogue shamans, microwaves, alien tech, blackmail, whatever. And Leilani G said, could XPROTECT be run by archons?
Oh, fascinating. Well, okay, you've opened up some good stuff there, so let's take a look at it. One, the astral aspect of it, we know the CIA is obsessed with this. That is, they want an astral weapon. That's where we get them using things like remote viewing. Now, remote viewing is one thing. Remote influencing is another. So remote intimidation, you get people who get targeted by directed energy weapons. Okay. Now, I'm sure there are many people out there who come forward on that who are legit, just as much as we have people come out and just have the paranoia that they're being chased or whatever. But there are legit people who get targeted in this way. And I know that there's a few people looking deep into this, and I think it's a worthwhile topic. I think Catherine Horton is in the lead on this issue of late. But so I think we can look at it like that. So if you have directed energy weapons that you can use, then you have a vast array of tools. So that's one, right? We know the kind of disinformation is another one. But it is true that since the intelligence agencies are obsessed with an advantage and that they've used these types of tactics before, when we run into XPROTECT around the UFO file, we have a great history of people who've researched it up close. John Keel, Frank Edwards, Donald Kehoe, they gave us the foundation. It seems like the mantle was dropped and they made the Men in Black into a game and they made the Men in Black into movies and stuff. But the fundamental idea of a UFO cover-up being instigated by unusual figures is, I think, going just as strong as it ever has, and that we still have that aspect out there. So XPROTECT is important to bring into mind because we often hear about intimidation, but I can tell you for a fact that in cases like that are classic, that the XPROTECT people show up in the Betty and Barney Hill case, that they show up in the Rendlesham Forest case, that they even show up in the Phoenix Lights case. But certainly in earlier cases like Morris Jessup or the Philadelphia experiment, the idea was this guy's too articulate. He's going to reveal too much. He has to be eliminated. They've certainly gone down the road of discrediting people along that line. So I think of XPROTECT as a dedicated group, like a covert intelligence wing, specifically to keep people away from the Apotheum secret inside the UFO file that relates to the X technology. That's the kind of capsule way to look at them, but they carry a lot of different aspects. And I think that the idea of thinking of them as an astral agency is good, because I think that they do work on that level, and that it is, for want of a better word, psychic attack. So we see a lot of different cases of people talking just about that. But, it's also interesting to me in Keel's work that after this waves and waves of sightings that were happening in the 60s and 70s, when he would show up to talk to these people, they would be like, we had these people visit us and they were intimidating, and they always had the same characteristics, that they kind of looked like those Sami people, but they were in these sharp suits and they were very unusual, and that people seemed to lose their will around them. I found that very interesting too, that they almost had a kind of a hypnotic quality to them. And at other times they would act almost like they were wound up and then they had stopped. So there's all sorts of weird things like, clones or whatever you would think about them. But fundamentally, the idea that there's some sort of projection, certainly, since we understand things on this program and get into things of a psychic nature on this program, and we have mystery school background, in terms of the background that the mystery schools have left us, we can look at this from a much broader palette and perspective. So that's a great question, though. Right on. And we saw Rika, the hopeful voluntarist, out there. I want to say hello. It's great to see you.
We've had people in the chat tonight we haven't seen in ages.
That's what New Year's will do. Fantastic. It's great names. I wanted to shout out a few more. You can shout out a few if I lost anybody. Go ahead.
Well, David Donaway, and who was, I think, starting days ago,
yes,
right in the chat.
This is interesting because, of course, the chat is always available out there. Sometimes we'll pop in there and see. David always writes interesting things before the show, so thank you very much. Najat, it's great. Happy New Year. And Daniel Natal, it's great to see you out there. Justin Thomas, excellent. Fantastic. Wow. Happy New Year, everyone. Boy, is it great to be back and to see everyone. We have a very exciting year coming up together. We'll be back Friday night at 7 p.m. We're going deep. And what is
Friday's show on?
Well, actually,
Do we know?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It looks like I'm thinking about having a guest, but I have the next X show ready. But if the guests come on, I'll do that instead. So we'll certainly announce it probably sometime tomorrow.
I do want to say, I think we've never really done a proper show on the moon. And we had a lot of questions about it that I put aside that you can take a look at.
Yes.
And that would be fantastic.
Oh, well, we have two really fascinating points on that relating to our friend Joseph Farrell, but also to Rudolf Steiner's view on the moon. So we definitely will be doing that. And I want to remind everyone, go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, keep us in touch with each other, get behind the show in 2019. We have many public events coming up this year that's different from last year. So you're going to want to be a member in order to get information on those first. So make the jump and do it. And get behind it. Mysterious Forces Live. It's great to see you out there. And we will see everyone. Breach 123. Excellent questions tonight. Thank you very much. I'm getting so into saying hello to everyone because it's such a great crowd. We will see everyone on Friday at 7 p.m. in our normal time, in our normal station. And Occult Fan, there he is. The man, the myth. Carl Young with a Y. Yes, always watching out for that. And thank you, everyone, for all your efforts. And we will see you all. The only question is, Olivia, what is the quote of the night?
Well, it is the return of the fish food, which is not fish.
Oh, that sounds like good dinner.
Fish food is a flavor of frozen yogurt.
Did you have a quote of the night tonight, or is that my imagination?
Well, I'm going to post it on when the
show's over
on YouTube.
Okay, I like it.
It's fantastic.
And this, I'll tell you, this was my Christmas present. Was the Starsky and Hutch Ford Torino.
Zebra 3.
We know it's Zebra 3, and we know it's good. By the way, there is an episode where Starsky and Hutch fight the Deep State. It's called...
Actually, there's a couple episodes.
I know, but the one I'm thinking of is The Setup.
Yeah, Setup Part 1 and Part 2. Great. But Targets Without a Badge.
Targets Without a Badge is also another one.
In the 70s, they seemed to understand this stuff. It's because of Watergate. It just...
Well, you had, first of all, you had the intelligence agencies being investigated in the 70s. People understood.
Church Committee, right?
Yeah, the Church Committee was happening. The Pike Committee, the House Assassinations Committee. Fantastic. Gigi Young is out there. Happy New Year, Gigi. Fantastic, amazing stuff from Gigi Young last year. And just wait for Gigi this year. Amazing. We will see everyone next Friday.
This Friday.
This Friday. Oh, boy. I'm jumping ahead already. And I guess fish food it is.
And we get the chocolate cake left over.
Oh, that's an interesting thing. Okay, then maybe no fish food.
No fish food on the chocolate cake with hot chocolate on the side. It's all chocolate all the time right now.
Chocolate wins. That's 2019. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next Friday.
Okay, good night, everybody.
7 p.m. Eastern. Chocolate.
Chocolate, chocolate, chocolate.